Julia Garner stars as a struggling dancer who's drawn in by dark forces in the new psychological thriller Apartment 7A. Buy it on digital or stream it now on Paramount Plus. Rated R. Head to ParamountPlus.com/Apartment7A to try it free.
If you're hearing this in your Rolls Royce, then Donald Trump's tax plan is for you.
You're rich as hell. We're going to give you a tax cut?
But for everyone else, there's Kamala Harris's plan.
Under my plan, more than 100 million Americans will get a tax cut.
Because that guy in the Ferrari doesn't need another break. But Kamala Harris knows you sure could use one. Paid for by FFPAC, ffpac.org. Not authorized by any candidate or candidates committee.
This is the sound of your ride home with Dad after he caught you vaping. Awkward, isn't it? Most vapes contain seriously addictive levels of nicotine and disappointment. Know the real cost of vapes. Brought to you by the FDA.
Slashers, huh? What's your favorite scary movie?
Not that one.
And welcome back to Horror Queers. We're talking, no, Claire, that's the Mormon Tabernacle Choir doing their annual obscene phone call. We're talking The New Exchange, Fellatio. And we're talking, your phone's ringing. And I'm Joe.
And I'm Trace, and we're talking turtles that can screw for 3 days without stopping.
No, really. I was there. I didn't watch the whole thing, though.
I fully almost did the you can't rape a townie joke, but I was like, I don't want to open with a rape thing. But
I mean, you just did, technically.
I know, but like, it's a line of dialogue that I forgot was in this movie, and when it happened, I fully went, oh!
Yeah, it's so offensive, but it's also classic Barb.
Classic Barb. Everyone, if you cannot tell what we are talking about based on those little lines of dialogue, which I think all of them were Barb, we are discussing Bob Clark's iconic horror film, like seminal, whatever the fuck have you, Black Christmas.
Yes, 1974. We have already covered the other two versions.
Shit, I was like, wait, we covered the 2006 one, but I forgot we covered the 2019 one.
And guess what, folks? We actually like them all, but for very different reasons.
Yeah, I mean, there's a clear weak member of the pack, but, you know, go listen to them and figure out which one that is.
There we go. Yeah.
Oh, Joe, I'm so excited for this. But, you know, because we've been doing this kind of theme of, what week are we in of our anniversaries and divas, Joe?
We're in 5 of 7.
5 of 7. So, of course, we've got another juggernaut on our hands. So before we just dive right into it, let's bring in our guest who is waiting in the wings. Everyone, she is an award-winning Australian film critic who specializes in gender, genre, representations of sexual violence, cult and horror film, and women's filmmaking. You may also have read her books, Rape Revenge Films, A Critical Study, Found Footage Horror Films, Fear and the Appearance of Reality, and the Giallo Canvas, Art, Excess, and Horror Cinema. Or you may have heard her hundreds, quite literally, of audio commentaries and film essays. Please welcome Alexandra Heller-Nicholas.
Ho, 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 fuck. I've been sitting here quietly waiting to announce myself with the most wonderful film quote of all time. Ho, 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 shit. I love, they say that the perfect film doesn't exist. Wrong answer. Oh, look, it does. And it's this one. I love this movie. I'm so excited.
It's so interesting. I've seen this film several times, but it's not one that I've revisited a ton. But every time I watch it, I know. We'll get into it. But I always forget just how fucking funny this movie is.
Hilarious. Bob Clark was really funny. Like a really funny filmmaker.
I mean, let's not forget that he also does one of the classic comedy films as well, right?
Porky's, yeah.
Yeah.
Right.
I was waiting, Joe, I was waiting for you to, I was baiting you. It's not Porky's.
I mean, a lot of people in this film are associated with Porky's, though.
They really are. He kept a lot of the same crew around for Porky's. I've only seen Porky's once, but it was one that my dad really, really, really liked, which, you know.
Well, yes.
Yeah. It kind of makes
what
sense.
we know of your dad, that makes sense.
Yes. But Alexandra, welcome to the show. So, Black Christmas, what is your relationship? Do you remember when you first saw this film?
Yeah, it was in the 90s. It would have been the late 90s. And it was back when I thought that there was a future in an academic career. So it was before I did my master's and my PhD. I have a comically amusing and very useless PhD in film, which is a whole other conversation. But I started off very much with a kind of critical interest in slasher film. And slasher is like home to me. I watch this film like ASMR. Like I'll just have it in the background on a loop. And what is really interesting about this film, I think, is that it was largely, in terms of sort of scholarly work at least, it was really kind of invisible.
It was overlooked for a long time, right?
For a really long time. And I was really shocked when I finally saw it because it's like, you know, why didn't Carol Clover write about this? Why didn't Barbara Creed write about this? You know, like how did this film vanish? And that it really was about sort of the late 90s, 2000s that this film started getting included in those conversations. And it was such a strange blind spot. And I think if I have to pinpoint a moment where my cynicism of academia started, maybe Black Christmas is it. So for that reason, I cherish it.
There we go.
But I remember watching it and being absolutely shocked. It's like, this is all of the things that I've been told horror is. You know, it's about boys and the male gaze and it's, you know, it's very sort of male-centric. This film is, it just, you know, 1974 throws all of that out the window. Before we even get to Halloween, before we even get to Friday the 13th, we have this film that is so strongly women-centered. In just bold and really exciting and really explicit ways, which I'm sure we will talk about more.
Yeah, I think the fact that it is 1974 makes, like, as time goes by, it becomes more and more impressive that it came out at that time. But Joe, because I know this is one of, if not your favorite film, one of your favorite horror films of all time.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a top 3 film for me. This is the reason I scoffed when you said you don't watch it too often, Trace, is not anything to do with you. It's everything to do with me because I have to watch this movie at least 2 times a year. So I always watch it on Christmas Eve, but I usually tend to watch it at least one other time. It's 100% a comfort watch for me. I love it.
Yeah, no, it's not because I do love this film, but it's definitely a film where I think I watched it when the 2006 remake was coming out. And I was like, you know, because I would have been 15, 16, 17 at that time. So I was like, okay, I got to bone up on the original before I go see the remake. And I really liked it, but I didn't really appreciate it as much until my later years, which is, you know, par for the course for me.
Yes.
But every time I watch it, because I've been trying to make it more of a Christmas staple, like, you know, where it's like, okay, like Christmas Eve, I'm going to watch Black Christmas, but it's not really something my mom and sister really care to watch.
Oh, really? That's funny because I'm thinking of what Alexandra just said, and I find that this film really does appeal to women if you can get them to kind of sit down and say like, hey, this is a good one for you.
I totally agree. It's just really hard to get my mom to say, like, yes, let's watch a horror movie on Christmas Eve, you know?
Okay, fair.
Do you know who was a huge fan of this film and would watch it religiously on Christmas Eve or Christmas Day until he died? Elvis.
Oh, really?
Elvis, I'm not shitting you. Elvis fucking loved this film.
That's wild.
I just love that so much. It's like, of course he did. It was like the kind of, I mean, what, he died in 77?
Yeah, so he had 3 full years with this movie.
And he just spent those 3 years loving this film. Apparently he just went absolutely bananas for it. And it's like, if it's good enough for Elvis, it's good enough for Joe's mom. Trace's mom. Both of your moms.
It's fine, but both of our moms, yes. Well, actually, Joe, I feel like my mom would be more inclined to watch it than yours. Or does your mom watch it?
No, my mom doesn't watch this movie. My sister and I watch this movie religiously, though.
Yeah, but I will say, and this is more for my neck of the woods than anyone else's, but everyone, if you are a Denver resident, I will be screening this for Terror Tuesday in December at the Alamo Drafthouse. So please be on the lookout.
There we go.
But okay. So let's dive into this production history, which admittedly there's not a lot of juicy tidbits about this movie. It's all very harmonious, which maybe makes for a less dramatic production history, but no less interesting. So, So, of course, yeah, Black Christmas, this is kind of one of the prototypes for the modern slasher film, But, in some ways, it did kind of change the way horror films were made. It set this template for virtually any slasher that came afterward. We have the killer in the house terrorizing women, group of people being picked off one by one, the POV shots of the faceless killer.
Yep.
So, the film starts out as a script called The Babysitter, and it was written by this guy named Roy Moore, who hadn't really done much since this movie. There was a 1981 dystopian sci-fi film called The Last Chase starring Lee Majors that he wrote, but that's kind of his only other claim to fame. So anyway, the crux of the script was, that old urban legend. A babysitter is answering the phone and the call is coming from inside the house, which we would, of course, see quite literally adapted in, I want to say 79 with When a Stranger Calls.
Yes.
As no one's questioning that, and I'm moving on. Eventually, though, he kept revising the script, and it became something a little bit closer to what Black Christmas would become, but we're still doing The Babysitter. But he changed the name of the script to Stop Me! !
No.
Yes.
Not feeling it.
He sent out hundreds of copies of the script to every production company he could find, and it eventually got to a production company called Vision 4, which Bob Clark was a part of. And Clark is an interesting figure. So, admittedly, y'all, I don't have a lot of experience with Bob Clark films. Like, it's Black Christmas and Porky's. I've never even seen A Christmas Story. So, I know.
It's an acquired taste. It's not my favorite, but people will immediately now begin yelling at you, Trace. You're going to shoot your eye out with that thing, kid.
I know all the jokes, and I've seen, they would do those 24-hour marathons of it on, TBS or TNT or something, and I just never turned it on.
Right. Yeah.
But anyway, so Black Christmas would be Clark's fourth feature film, but his third horror film, which is bizarre, right? He leaves horror by the 80s. But the first two horror films he did were 1972's Children Shouldn't Play with Dead Things, which is a tongue-in-cheek homage to Night of the Living Dead.
Amazing.
It's a good one.
Okay, good, because I've never seen this. I've heard the name a lot. I feel like I always get it confused with Something Wicked This Way Comes, because they're both just really long titles.
And both have to do with kids.
Yeah,
sort of.
Exactly. His other film was 1974's Death Dream, and both of these films were shot in Florida. And, when you're talking about the guy that really made a lot of money from Porky's and A Christmas Story, you're like, oh, well, why was he doing horror in the beginning of his career? That's because, in his words, the easiest films to get distributed were horror films and pornos, and he didn't want to do pornos.
Where have we heard this before, Trace?
Everywhere? Every single fucking director?
Every single director. Don't call it a horror film, but I just want to work or dabble in genre because, it's what makes money.
And you don't need a star. You can do it on a low budget. It's...
Yep. So, interestingly enough, though, Clark went to Canada to do the post-production on Death Dream, and while he was there, he fell in love with the country, saying, and I quote, "It's fresh and vibrant like the people." So, he immigrated there and spent the next 10 to 12 years of his career living as an expatriate in Toronto.
Love it.
So, anyway, Clark got his hands on more script, and he liked it, but he thought it was too violent and more of a slasher film than he wanted to make, which... He's saying slasher film, all of this information I'm pulling is from all the bonus features on Scream Factory's Blu-ray, which is pretty decked out
good.
in featurettes and interviews. But, I don't know if back then, would the term slasher have been around in 1974?
No, it was really like a late 70s kind of phenomenon, even though, there's the prehistory.
Yeah.
Right. And dating all the way, I mean, Psycho, I know we talk about a lot. I'm sure there were other things there.
They were also called, slice and dice or slash and dice films.
Yes.
And the Stalker film, they were called Stalker films for a while.
That was the big one.
Yeah.
So it may have been one of those. I mean, and this film really ticks the box as a Stalker film.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
So the kind of slasher kind of came later, it kind of evolved later. But there's that great book, Games of Terror by Vera Dicker, which is really one of the great unheralded books on slasher. And she calls it the Stalker film, the Stalker cycle. That is just as important, if not more important, than things like the Carol Clover and the Barbara Creed books. I think it's a crime that book has been kind of neglected. Vera Dicker, Games of Terror, the Stalker film. Chase it down.
Because we definitely had Barbara Creed and Carol Clover when I was in film school, but we didn't have that.
Yeah.
But Anyway, so yeah, he thought it was too violent, and so he made some changes. And this included changing it from a babysitter protagonist to a house of sorority girls. However, I love the reasoning for this. It's because he wanted to not have child characters in the film.
Yep, because he had worked with children before, and he was like, I'm good, thank you.
He also wanted to emphasize the adultness, quote unquote, of college students, specifically their humor and their playfulness. And this was because he didn't think college students had been portrayed with any sense of reality in American cinema by 1974, saying, college students, even in 1974, are astute people. They are not fools. It's not all beach blankets, bikinis, and bingo. Bingo. The other thing he did, and I think this is one of the keys to the film's success, was add more humor to the story, specifically Barb's drunken foul mouth. He based the character of Mrs. Mack, the house mother, on his Aunt Mabel. Not 1-to-1 ratio comparison, but like his Aunt Mabel hid booze all around the house, much like Mrs. Mack does in this film.
Right.
It was also his idea to never show the killer, something Moore was initially opposed to, but eventually came around to. And this worked out, though, because I do believe, because of the way Clark and cinematographer Reginald H. Morris shoot the film with the camera almost constantly moving, there's a certain point in the film, and I can't really pinpoint it, but where you're just not quite sure if you're looking through the killer's POV or just the camera's POV.
Right. The audio commentary that Bob Clark does, there's times that he forgets and he's not sure, and he calls it this subjective camera, and he's not sure, and you can actually hear him saying, okay, I think this is subjective camera, but in that commentary the word that he uses the most is dynamic. He's constantly talking. It's all about movement, and when you watch the film from that perspective, even shots that are of somebody on the phone, which is a pretty kind of frequent shot, the camera is constantly moving, or they're moving, and he keeps talking about this drumbeat of it being this sort of dynamic energy. And it's so bang on. It's almost like the key to unlocking how this film works. But I love that he wasn't completely sure himself, in retrospect, what was a subjective shot and what wasn't. That blurred for him too.
That's just how effective it is. It's so effective. And it gives the film, because it's, we spend the bulk of the film in the house. We leave it, to go to the park or the police station or whatever. But we're dealing with this actual house that's in Toronto. And it gives the film kind of an energy where I feel like a lesser director that would just shoot a lot of these things very statically, it would be very boring to watch.
Totally. That dynamic aspect of the film, it's literally its energy. That feeling that something's constantly moving, constantly creeping, and the fact that you can't always tell what's a subjective shot and what's not. It gives it this really unsettling feeling. Fabulous.
Yeah, there's one moment in the film, I'll highlight it when we go through the plot, but I remember thinking wait, whose perspective is this? And it's revealed to be Jess as she goes up the stairs.
Right. Amazing.
Well, interestingly enough, though, even though Roy Moore has the sole screenwriting credit, Clark says he probably wrote half of the script. There's one really good soundbite from him that I appreciate where he says, people say the script is everything. The script is not everything. The actors are everything. Give me a great script and 6 mediocre actors, and I'm probably going to give you a pretty mediocre film. But give me a mediocre script and 6 great actors, and I can give you a great film, and so can any other decent director.
Beautiful.
I don't know that I entirely agree with that, because I've seen some films with pretty mediocre scripts and great actors, and it's still an okay-ish film. I think he needs to give himself some credit as a director, because he pulls things out of these actors and then he shoots it in that dynamic way.
Well, but that's the thing, though. Are they great actors giving great performances to a mediocre script, or are they great actors being lazy with a mediocre script?
Who could say?
But when it comes to casting, Olivia Hussey was the first actress that Bob Clark thought of for Jess, because he really liked her in Franco Zeffirelli's Romeo and Juliet from '68.
This movie gets so much fucking mileage out of her casting. Trace, you are too young for this. Alex, I think you and I are probably in the same generation, where it's that is a film that a certain group of people have incredibly fond memories of. It was shown in
really
high school.
Iconic. Yeah, absolutely. It's hard to explain today how big that film
She was huge. Like, she was Juliet to an entire generation of people.
I do just want to say that my Houston, Texas-based high school, circa 2003...
They showed the tatas?
100% showed me Romeo and Juliet, and we had to get a permission slip signed for the nudity forever.
There we go. And there it is. That's America in a nutshell.
Just tick a little box that says boobs.
Yes.
But yes, I have seen that Romeo and Juliet. But so they just made her an offer. And she apparently needed the work, read the script. And this is an anecdote that I had heard before, but it was fun hearing it from her mouth. She had apparently gone to a psychic who told her that she would be involved in a film in Canada that would make a great deal of money. And so that was the extra push she needed to take the part in this movie.
Too funny.
She was like, she seemed to be heavily into psychics during this period.
Yeah.
Oh, really?
Like, there's the whole thing about a psychic was telling her that she was going to meet and fall in love with Paul McCartney while she was making the film. So Olivia Hussey being cast in this was super interesting. She's talked about the fact that she'd actually had a baby by the time she went to do this film. So she had a newborn. And she was being offered, I guess on the back of Romeo and Juliet, she sort of found herself being offered very kind of similar parts.
Right.
And this film apparently, this script really struck her because it was something a little bit different. It was the kind of character that she hadn't seen a lot in film and that she certainly hadn't been offered a lot. So I think for, this new mum, like trying to kind of reconceive where she fits in the world and identity as a mum and, the kind of stuff that you go through when you have a baby. This film was sort of played a really key part in that for Hussey, I think. So it's a really unusual film in terms of her filmography up to that point. And I do think it shows remarkable integrity and bravery for her to actually go from something like Romeo and Juliet to this.
Well, I think even given just like the arc that Jess has, I mean, this is an abortion-heavy plot, which, I mean, outside of it being 1974 and not really common in cinema at the time, that would be one of your follow-ups to your, like, award-winning performance in Romeo and Juliet.
We'll probably talk about this more later, but in 2018, Olivia Hussey went on the record with very credible allegations that she was raped by her boyfriend at the time in Roman Polanski's house in 1969.
Oh,
and she
shit.
She became pregnant as a result of that assault and terminated the pregnancy. So she came to Black Christmas having had an abortion, which was a result of rape.
And then also being a new mom. Wow.
Right. So I don't think we can underplay, she's a very elegant lady. I don't know if you've ever seen her interviewed. She's very, very elegant and very poised. And I would assume that, perhaps that's what she's like in person. But for her to sort of go on the record with that in 2018, I think was really remarkable. And it was almost one of those sort of little Tetris moments where you sort of look back from 2018, you hear that story, you look back to Black Christmas and it's like, oh, okay.
It all clicks into place.
Right, right.
So Margot Kidder, who of course is Barb in the film.
Our queen.
Yes, an absolute queen. So she had been in Sisters the previous year, 1972, like the year before they were filming it. I know. But yeah, she wasn't famous yet. So she wasn't Lois Lane yet. And she didn't think much of the movie when she was filming it, but after production got Hussey and Keir Dullea, who of course was still hot after starring in 2001: A Space Odyssey a few years earlier, people around town started paying attention to the project. And Kidder, again, loved the role, which I'm like, well, who wouldn't love this role? Sure. And came aboard. There's also a few what-if casting factoids, too. For instance, Bette Davis was the very first choice to play Mrs. Mack, but she decided not to do it. Gilda Radner was originally cast as Phil, but had to drop out when she got Saturday Night Live a month before filming was set to begin. So they replaced her with Andrea Martin, who, Joe, I had no idea was Second City Television alumni.
Okay, we have had this conversation before and recently, and I can't remember why. But yeah, literally because I remember saying, SCTV, that's Canadian version of SNL. So, folks, I have no idea when we said this, but we've said it before.
Are you sure it wasn't the 2006 remake of Black Christmas that we did like 5 years ago?
You know what? It could be that.
It might have been that, honestly. It's, that was pre-pandemic. It was a long time ago.
Truly.
For Lieutenant Fuller, the role that would be played by John Saxon, Clark actually wanted and did hire Academy Award winner Edmund O'Brien to play the part. But unfortunately, O'Brien appeared in Toronto like 2 days before he was supposed to be on set to get his costuming done. And he was suffering the effects of Alzheimer's disease and was getting progressively worse and worse every day. So they had to tell him, like, you can't play this part. And not like badly. He quite literally didn't know where he was half the time.
I think Bob Clark has a story that he was like, really, he's like, Alzheimer's takes time. He might need a little bit of help, but he can probably do the role.
Sure.
And he went to talk to him, and it took O'Brien an hour to get his jacket on.
Yeah.
Oh, no.
And he just said it was heartbreaking. One of the producers of the film spoke about this as well, and they were like, it was really heartbreaking, but there was palpable anger at the agent. It's like the agent would have known before putting him on a plane and sending him to Toronto to do this film.
That's
so
awful.
There was a lot of sadness when both Clark and the producer spoke about this. They were like really heartbroken by it. Well, it was you could hear the pain in their voice when they spoke about it.
Well, because they really wanted him, and like they had no idea what was going on. And then the other weird thing is that the John Saxon was accidentally offered that part, and then the casting agent had to be like, "Oh my god, I'm so sorry. Like we actually already cast the part. You weren't meant to get that phone call."
Oh wow!
And so then when they had to fire O'Brien, they reached back out to Saxon and say, "Hey, psych, you actually do have the part. Please come over and film it."
Can you imagine getting that second phone call? Are you pranking me again? Is it real this time?
Yeah. Now, I think the production wasn't always taken seriously at the time because, I mean, it was a horror film and we all know how that goes, but there hadn't... Well,
no, I'm just thinking because I don't know if everybody knows the Canadian context, but like this was a period in Canada where we were in something called the tax shelter era. So basically, if you were rich and you were looking for a tax break, you could invest in Canadian films. And a lot of people made really cheap, low budget, shitty horror films. And sometimes that means we get amazing horror movies. And sometimes it means we get shitty ones that never even got released.
Yes. Well, Bob Clark was a young man who was very confident and knew exactly what he wanted. So, like, he won't start filming a movie until he's seen all of his sets, locations, and has rehearsed with his actors, which I was like,
nice.
Rehearsal? I mean, that's... I hope that
what a foreign concept.
Well, because I know, I know it's not super common for film sets to use rehearsal. Like, that's very much the director wants to have rehearsal. He has to like, specially request that, but maybe I'm wrong.
I think it used to be more common, and now it is uncommon, unless you're doing something like fight choreography.
Right, but still, some people were surprised when he came on set the first day of filming with a Rolodex full of cards every morning, which had scene numbers written down and the shots he wanted to do that day with like maps on the cards for like numbers playing with the actors and like a V playing the camera. And it was a lot of like, why is he so organized for this little horror movie? But it's because he gave a shit about it.
Yeah, because he wanted to make a fucking classic. That's why.
Now, filming took place in Toronto in the winter of 1973 and 74, with most of the shoot taking place in the sorority house, which was discovered on a Toronto side street after an exhaustive search. The Canadian Film Development Corporation, CFDC for short, had been formed in 1967. And, Joe, we talked about this a lot, but for anyone who has not heard us talk about this, this is basically a government corporation that allocated money every year in support of the country's feature film industry. So in 1967, they were giving $10 million to films. By 1976, so 2 years after this film came out, they were giving the film industry $25 million a year.
Yeah, because we are starting to realize that we could make fiction films and be profitable.
Yes. So Black Christmas had a budget of $671,000, which is about $4 million today when adjusted for inflation. But the CDFC provided $200,000, so nearly a third of its budget.
Because we like to invest in our art, even if people like my father say we shouldn't.
Well, Alexander, Alex, is it the same in Australia? Does Australia the government give money to film?
So the Australian model is actually very similar to the Canadian model, sans Cronenberg. So if you can imagine the Canadian model without a Cronenberg moment, which means that Australian cinema historically and to this very day has generally been relatively shithouse with supporting genre filmmakers.
Right.
If you have seen Late Night with the Devil, all of those cards at the start, all of the different production companies that put in money.
Like 20 of them.
Right. And that is because a film that should have, by all accounts, had significant government support didn't.
Do not.
Because this country has a fucking bug up its ass about horror film and doesn't get it at all. So we have anomalies like Relic, like Babadook. But these are sort of the exceptions that prove the rule. But the kind of history of Australian film is very, the film industry here is quite similar up to a point to Canada in terms of that kind of state funding model. We have Screen Australia, we have state bodies that play quite a significant role. And it is, certainly for genre filmmakers in this country, it's really hard. You kind of have to assume that you're not going to get that kind of support here. Whereas Canada, I think, again, that kind of Cronenberg factor, I think, when horror is tied so much to the national identity on film as it is in Canada, you have a very different kind of model, a different kind of attitude to horror that Australia has really never significantly been able to grasp. But it drives me crazy. But, I keep going back to Late Night with the Devil because I think it's such a classic case of a film that absolutely should have had government support. There was a whole range of horror films last year in 2023 that I think Talk to Me was really the only one that got any really significant state funding, government funding.
Well, so as for the theatrical release for Black Christmas, so it premiered on October 11th, 1974 in Canada. And coincidentally, this was also the same date as the Texas Chainsaw Massacre's release in the United States.
Yes, which is why we're covering it now as opposed to in December, in part also because people don't listen to our podcast as much in December, even if it is a holiday-themed film.
But it went on to a very successful run in Canada, grossing the second highest box office of any Canadian film at the time. It also became one of the first Canadian films to get a wide-scale American release, but that's where things turned shitty. This was because the American distributor who snatched up the film was Warner Brothers. But, and I didn't know this is the wild thing for me, because of the widespread popularity of blaxploitation cinema at the time, they didn't want to keep the name Black Christmas out of fear that audiences would think...
Really?
Racism!
They thought audiences would think it was a movie about Black people celebrating Christmas, and so they didn't want that title.
Yep.
That's amazing.
So they changed the title to Silent Night, Evil Night. They also wanted Clark to change the ending to something less ambiguous, but he refused.
Thank God. Thank God.
The film failed to match its successful Canadian run, however, when Warner Brothers decided to take things in a different direction. So, we switched the title, blah, blah, blah. We don't change the ending, but it didn't work out, and they didn't seem to have a lot of confidence in it. So reviews were terrible. And while it doesn't mean much now, we are looking at a 68% on Rotten Tomatoes with an average score of 6.2 out of 10.
Bullshit.
I know.
You're all wrong.
I was really shocked though, because this is one of those films that it has this Halloween levels of iconography to it that you're like, okay, well clearly it's going to have at least an 80% on Rotten Tomatoes, and that is not the case with it. Maybe it's because if this had come out in 78 or 79, it would have had that because of Halloween, but it's stupid considering how much of an influence this film was on Halloween.
Yeah.
So Letterboxd users have luckily awarded it a 7.6 out of 10. And of course, it's gone on to become a classic of the horror genre to the point where it's received not one, but two remakes, one in 2006, which is the sleazy version of this movie, and another in 2019, which is the
sort of in name only.
Yeah,
remake.
The big swing, but kind of bland, but has a lot of on its mind that I respect, but it's still the execution is not there.
I think it's a spiritual remake. It's like a spiritual.
There we go.
Yeah. Yes. It's definitely more feminist than the 2006 one is. I will give it that.
I really pack a bong for the last one, for the Sophia Tackle one, because I really it was like the Craft legacy, and that I liked that the energy of them was sort of instead of rehashing the same stuff over and over again, what they instead decided to do was okay, well, what happens if we resituate this beyond what was done? What if we do new heavy lifting? So the original of both the original of the Craft is sort of very much focused on the toxicity between the girls. So what if in the next one we take that and look at the toxicity coming from men? So it's like a logical progression. And I think there's a similar step that's taken between the Black Christmas original and the most recent version. It's okay, well, what if we take the kind of the focus from the first one and change it to something that's more contemporary, sort of something more systemic, something more institutionalized, which I think you can argue, that might be a little more conceptually
challenging.
Yeah, whether it works or not is up to, up to everybody who watches it. But I kind of like the swing that both the Craft legacy and the Black Christmas reboot took. I like that they approached it in that way.
Well, it's the thing where, because with both of the Black Christmas remakes, they had studio troubles. I mean, because with 2019, Blumhouse sent them to call and April Wolf. In July of 2019, we're like, hey, get us a Black Christmas movie. We're going to release it in December of 2019.
Yeah,
so they were on an
so rushed
expedited budget. I actually think they might have filmed it either in Australia or New Zealand.
Yeah, New Zealand.
Okay.
Yeah.
But then the 2006 one, that was a Weinstein production, which is, that should tell you all you need to know right there. Yeah.
And as we said, we've got episodes on both of them, so if you want to hear us unpack them in greater detail, be sure to go and check them out.
Yes. Now, for the original, though, a sequel was never made. But before I pass it off to you, Joe, I'll end with this funny little anecdote, which I'm sure a lot of Black Christmas superfans already know, but I did not. Bob Clark was going to direct a film that John Carpenter wrote a couple years after Black Christmas, which I'm guessing it never came to fruition. But while they were collaborating, Carpenter asked Bob Clark, oh, would you ever do a sequel to Black Christmas? And Clark was like, no, I'm done with that. And Carpenter was like, well, what if you did? Like, what would you do? And Clark's response was, well, I mean, I would probably set it during the following fall. With the killer institutionalized and have him escape and start stalking the girls again at the Black Christmas sorority house. I'd probably call it Halloween. And that's the end of that anecdote.
Wait, I don't get it. What's the payoff? What's the punchline?
He's like, I don't even know if John Carpenter would remember this, blah, blah, blah. But it's like, I mean, obviously he did his own thing with it, but it's just the title there where it's like, okay.
Yeah.
There is a kind of urban legend that the origins of Halloween were from Bob Clark, because John Carpenter was a huge fan of Black Christmas. Mm-hmm. But Clark himself has sort of joked about it. And he's if anything, he's like, I can't believe nobody had made a film called Halloween up until that point. It's insane to him that nobody had done it. He's like, it's such a perfect name for a horror film.
Right.
And he said, what Carpenter did with the film was completely different to what he would have done with it.
Right. Yeah.
So Clark seems like such a nice guy. Like, he was very humble.
Mm-hmm.
And he would often tell that story, but in a very kind of light, playful way. Right. I think he really enjoyed the urban legend, but was also at the same time, he wasn't a diva about it. Like some filmmakers who I won't mention, would be absolute shits about that. And Bob Clark he never had that tone. It was always playful. It was always respectful.
Yeah. No. And Black Christmas did earn its legacy, albeit nowhere near as quickly as Halloween did, but it got there over time.
Eventually.
Yeah.
Listen up, Rotten Tomatoes, assholes.
Indeed.
The new psychological thriller Apartment 7A is now streaming on Paramount+. Julia Garner stars as a struggling young dancer who suffers a devastating injury. Soon, she finds herself drawn in by dark forces when a peculiar, well-connected older couple promises her a shot at fame. Diane Wiest, Kevin McNally, and Jim Sturgis also star in the Paramount+ original movie. Buy Apartment 7A on digital or stream it now on Paramount+. Rated R. Head to ParamountPlus.com/Apartment7A to try it free.
Hey, it's me, the Quenchies. I'm that late afternoon craving you just can't shake. Wait, what's that? Welch's Grape Aid? No! Made with real fruit and no added sugar, nothing answers the call of the Quenchies like Grape Aid. Got the Quenchies? Grab a Grape Aid in your juice aisle.
ABC Wednesdays.
Y'all can play all day. We want books. We want paper towels in the classroom. Bet you want raises, too. I'm still waiting on the paper towels.
Abbott Elementary returns with a new season.
We asked the district for more after-school programs. They gave us $50 for class pets instead.
Critics cheer. Abbott Elementary continues to be one of the funniest and most beloved shows on TV.
What y'all doing out there? Taking bribes? Proud of y'all.
Abbott Elementary, Wednesdays, 9:30, 8:30 Central on ABC and stream on Hulu.
All right, so the film begins with Silent Night playing over the credits of a sorority house as we see Jess Bradford, Olivia Hussey, enter, and then we begin to cross-cut between a Christmas gift exchange / party and a heavy-breathing POV person who is climbing the outside of the house and entering the attic. And we will credit that the actor who's doing the POV shots is apparently Albert J. Dunk.
We get right into it, by the way. Like, this movie has no fat on it. We just get right into it with this POV killer getting into their house, and the nightmare begins.
Yep. Okay, so as I mentioned, we're doing this gift exchange. We don't really get to meet anybody. We just see that it is a sorority house because it's all women. But the person who immediately makes an impression is Barb, played by Margot Kidder, because she answers a phone call from her mother. And we're still doing the cross-cutting, so it's not a consistent conversation. But we do eventually learn that her mother is essentially bailing on Christmas. And this makes Barb very upset. And, you know, she kind of tries to make light of it by asking some of the other girls if they want to go skiing with her, if they want to go to the cottage. And everybody is kind of like, yeah, sure. Okay, Barb.
It's such an amazing introduction scene. The more that I watch it, the more it really is, I think, one of the strongest scenes in the whole film. And it's only when you sort of sit down and really look at it. This film won the award for best sound editing in a feature at the Canadian Film Awards. And when you watch this opening scene, you kind of get why, because although the plot, you know, the information that we're given here, the narrative information is exactly what you just spelt out. The way that that's delivered, you know, we have this constantly dynamic camera, but the camera at one point will be on a couple having a conversation, but we hear on the sound mix, just over the sound of them talking, we hear Margot Kidder's character on the phone. Like the sound editing in this opening sequence is next level. It's so complicated and so detailed, and the way that it kind of works with the nuance of the interpersonal relationships really starts to develop very, very strongly in these opening scenes. You know, we have, you know, Barb, who is such a tough girl character, but we have her visibly upset with her mum, and then she takes it out on Claire.
Yeah.
And then, you know, then we have, you know, there's this huge sort of wealth of really nuanced information that we get here that really plays under the surface. And it's not just the visuals. I think the sound design in this film in general is really extraordinary, but this opening sequence is, to me, where that sound design is really just on fire.
Yeah. So you mentioned Claire. That is Lynn Griffin. She's the quote-unquote good girl of the sorority.
Do you recognize her, Joe? She's in another very prominent Canadian slasher in a much bigger role.
Oh, and it's funny because I was like, I'm not going to look her up. I've looked up all the other characters in this film.
I won't say who she plays in it because it'd be a spoiler, but she is a major player in Curtains.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yeah.
Potential future episode as well.
Oh, absolutely future episode. I love Curtains.
I write on that in my book on Masters in Horror. I have a whole section.
I bet you do.
On Curtains. I love it.
That fucking hag mask.
Oh my God. That's... Don't even get me started.
Also, we've got a diva in that movie, Joe, Samantha Eggar.
Yes, we do. Yes, which is ironic that you're saying that because Claire, the character in this film, is dating Chris, who is a townie, but he's played by Art Hindle, who is in
The Brood.
The Brood with Samantha Eggar. Because Canadian cinema is a rich tapestry of about 5 degrees of Kevin Bacon. We should also note that Art Hindle, if people don't recognize him from The Brood, you may recognize him from Invasion of the Body Snatchers as well.
Also, Porky's and Porky's 2.
Yes, and Porky's. Okay, so Claire is kissing her boyfriend, Chris, goodbye. And this is when Jess picks up the first of many phone calls that she has nicknamed the Moaner, who is voiced by both Nick Mancuso as well as Bob Clark himself.
And a mystery third woman, which there's been mention of her in a couple of places that they've said that there was a woman involved, and they keep saying, I can't remember her name, so I'm not sure what the story is there. But I do love that there's this, like, if anybody's a horror screenwriter and you're looking for like a premise for a film, a meta film about who is this third woman, I'd kickstart the shit out of that.
There we go.
And I will say, so I whenever I cover films for this podcast, I always have subtitles on now just so I make sure I don't miss anything. But
sure,
for the Billy phone calls, definitely watch it with subtitles because there are some things that I think are unintelligible, but the subtitles spell them out for you.
Yep, they do.
Really appreciate. But Mancuso, so I at least know what he did to kind of get into character for the role. He wanted to compress his thorax to make it more of a guttural sound.
Oh, God.
So he recorded his lines while he was standing on his head.
Okay. A little bit method.
Clark's, anytime there was singing, that was likely Bob Clark. They also had, a harmonizer was a new device at the time, which was obviously, its purpose was to put things back in tune, but they used it for the opposite, where they would record things and use the harmonizer to detune things.
Oh, okay.
I love this stuff. Again, this goes into, the sound work on this film, where the music, they were doing things like throwing cutlery into the piano and then playing the piano, like crazy, discordant, amazing stuff. I love the Billy stuff. Apparently they spent 2 or 3 weeks just working on that audio.
Really?
And it's very carefully scripted. There's a whole, they had a whole backstory for Billy and Agnes. I have to say, I can't believe I haven't even said this yet, but I love slasher films. Slasher films for me are like coming home. I honestly don't think there's such a thing as a bad slasher film, because even the worst ones are still fucking slasher films, right? And that's home for me. I love them. I just have a default love for them. This is probably the only slasher film that I find genuinely terrifying. And I can honestly say that it's probably one of my top 3 horror films that genuinely scare me, no matter how many times I watch it. And listening to it recently and really paying attention to the soundtrack, it hit me all of a sudden that it really is connected in my mind, that the sound, these recordings of the Billy and Agnes stuff. Mm-hmm. It's tethered in my mind really strongly to the audio recordings in another film that I find genuinely terrifying, one of my top 3, which is Session 9. It almost feels like these recordings, to me it's almost like those recordings come from the same weird nightmare space, and they terrify me. No matter how many times I watch Black Christmas, the Billy stuff scares the shit out of me because it is unresolved, and it's so weird. It's just so disturbing.
It is very scary. And, I bought the soundtrack for Black Christmas because Waxworks Records did a print of it a couple of years ago.
They did.
But it's the thing where it's because the soundtrack for this movie never got an actual release because the score masters were thought to be lost for 40 years. And so Carl Zitter, the composer, who also composed Porky's and Christmas Story, he tracked them down. But then he constructed a cohesive Black Christmas film score experience. But again, some of the score is just fucking forks on piano wire. So it's it's one side of the vinyl is Christmas carols and the other half is just noise. But I use noise in a positive way.
Yeah. That is so fascinating too, because as you said, Trace, we just talked about the original Texas Chainsaw Massacre last week, and that one also had a very creatively constructed soundtrack.
One of the things I find really interesting in this film, and this is sort of jumping ahead a little bit, but it's not really talked about much, but it's Keir Dulley's character, when he plays his little piano music, he's not doing Mozart. It's this really discordant kind of experimental, you know what I mean? It's this really kind of quote unquote weird music. And I love that kind of ties, so much of the stuff in this film consciously that Bob Clark and his team did, so much of it was consciously trying to tie his character to Billy.
Yeah.
To this sort of, and I think that's a really key marker that the kind of music that he's playing, it's not pretty piano music. It's this really kind of experimental, and there's kind of a moral or ethical cloud that hangs over, I think, his choice of music. He goes badly because he's playing quote unquote weird music. You get something similar in a film a couple of years later, Lipstick, the rape revenge film, the Lamont Johnson film, where you have this really nice looking guy, but he's really into experimental music, and that casts him in this kind of morally or ethically kind of weird kind of light. It's maybe he's a bit strange because he likes this weird music. And I do think you really get the origins of that very much in the Keir Dulley character in this film.
I have a question for you two, because I don't know if it's just that by the time I came to this movie, I knew that we don't get any kind of confirmation as to who Billy is. I knew the end of the film, I think, even before I first saw it, but I never suspect Peter. Peter is such an obvious red herring to me, but I recognize that maybe that, I do think the intention is that we are meant to suspect him, right?
I think it's a deliberate red herring. I mean, they've spoken about that. But at the same time, Bob Clark has been very, very clear that it's absolutely not him.
Right.
There's no ambiguity about that at the end of the film. He's sort of, one of the regrets that he has is that he didn't make that clearer, that it's definitely not Peter.
Oh, I think it's so clear. That's funny.
I think it is too. I think it's kind of a no-brainer.
But to your point, Joe, I think the obviousness of it, it doesn't hurt the film in my experience, because while I think Peter is an obnoxious character, again, that whole abortion subplot, his character at least makes sense. He's an asshole and just needs to go away. But I think without that conflict, yes, I would be more annoyed with this Peter's the red herring type thing. But I think at least his own personal drama outside of the killings going on, they work in the context of the film.
And what I think is really, really important too is that there's a kind of ambient male shitheadry in this film.
Oh, yes.
And I think that first phone call is really important because they're not bothered by it. You know, it only becomes dark when they say at the end of the call, I'm going to kill you. Up until that point, they're kind of creeped out. But, you know, they're joking about, it's the Mona again. You know, it's like, this is like nothing out of the ordinary for these girls to get prank calls. And they're kind of freaked out by it because it's pretty full on.
Well,
but you know, the idea is really until that voice says, I'm going to kill you. Margot Kidder's character is like, we get this all the time in the city. This is just another day being a woman. And at the same time, what the film does, so there's this sort of ambient male badness, but at the same time, we do have these great male characters. You know, we have John Saxon's character. You know what I mean? So it's not like all men are bad, but there's also this sort of, we live in a world where there's some pretty shitty guys.
But and this is from one of the journalists, I think, who's on one of these documentaries that I watched for this. But so, and they said, you know, Clark was interested in equality issues, racism, and gender politics. But then talking about like the male characters in the film versus the female characters, you know, they say, well, you've got a cop who's a complete buffoon, an angry boyfriend who can't control his emotions, boyfriends who can't keep their girlfriends safe. In the end, it's the women that have to take care of themselves, and that's a very common trait of Canadian cinema. They just have they meaning Canadians, have a very hard time depicting masculinity on screen. And I thought that was an interesting take. Joe, do you find that in Canadian films, Joe?
Oh, yeah. No, we literally have an academic piece that's deconstructing the different depictions of men. And it's like basically the prevailing thought, and modern scholars would disagree with this, but especially in the 70s, we looked at ourselves as inferior to Americans. So we were always like the loser shithead younger brother to Americans. So all of our male characters are like losers, weak, castrated, all this kind of stuff. So that makes total sense.
I think Claire's father, Mr. Harrison, who again we'll touch on perhaps more shortly, but I think he really taps into this, the kind of impotent father. You know, the idea that he's this protective figure. I love how ambivalent the film is about Mr. Harrison. You know, I love that we don't find Claire's body at the end, so he's sort of still hanging. You know, he's this really, like, he is the impotent father figure. You know, he's there, you know, he's trying to be this sort of old-fashioned, upright, protective figure, and he's not. You know, there's no place for him in this world. And the ambivalence, this deep, deep ambivalence that this film has for his character at the end, it's, in a way, I think it's one of the cruelest parts of the film is sort of how it's just so completely fucking disinterested in his pain. And I love that. I love that. But it's like this is not the world where fathers protect daughters. They've got to look after themselves.
While battling with a man who likes to brag about how he's a tuna farm.
Oh my God.
That was the one part of his call where I was like, that's an interesting phrase.
Yeah. I mean, I do think you're right, Alexandra. The opening phone call is really important, not just for setting this benchmark of, okay, the girls are kind of used to this. There's a sexualized language to it. There's a violence in the sexualized language, but also, you know, we even set up a pretty important conflict early on between Barb and Claire, where Barb is comfortable with this, Claire is not. That's very telling about their two individual characters. And then from this point on, we establish that kind of benchmark, and we will gauge the other phone calls. Like, the phone calls only get weirder as we go. And I can understand why for the remake, we get so interested in the Billy and Agnes relationship, because it is telling a story, but there's a lot of gaps in it. And that's exciting for a filmmaker in terms of, what kind of story can I tell that adds to this?
But at the same time, if you look, like Bob Clark says, no, I have a narrative and backstory for Billy. I'm not putting it all in the film, but like, it's basically, like he killed his sister Agnes. He probably killed his parents. He went off on a rampage. There you go.
Yeah.
For me personally, and this is just a taste thing rather than like a critical, objective critical observation, one of the ballsiest things that this film does is not give us that backstory. And it refuses to kind of reconcile. And that to me is what makes this such a scary film. And the 2006 version, it totally makes sense to dig into that Billy story. But I was sort of personally quite ambivalent about that film, because that was like the one thing that I don't want to know about. Like, that's the least that's the least interesting part of the story that I need fleshed out. It's obvious. Of course they were going to do it. Good for them. I certainly don't hate it, and I don't think it was, I don't think it's a terrible film. But for me, I just had no interest. It's like, I don't want that backstory.
No.
I don't disagree with you, Alex. And it's a thing where I have grown to actually quite like that 2006 remake over time. But it's a thing where, I mean, I want to say it's a 50-50 split. Maybe 2/3, 1/3 between the flashbacks to Billy and the actual girls. And every time we cut to the flashbacks, I'm just like, I just want to spend more time with the girls. Like, the girls are really fun characters in that movie. But I feel like we don't, like, and their intros are great. But because we're divvying up that runtime, we don't get to know them as well as we do the girls in this film. And I do appreciate how tacky that film looks, how fucking audacious it is. It is so sleazy.
It's gross.
All of that stuff, I really it's everything this film is not, which again, I appreciate. But yeah, the Billy stuff just drags that movie down.
I have to say too, I mean, just talking about this opening sequence, I don't think you can underplay the power of the word cunt that is deployed in this film.
I was wondering when we were going to get to it.
So I'm Australian. That's like...
It's a common
word.
Right?
Yeah, right. Yeah. I understand Americans are a little more uptight about this, the word cunt. In Australia, it's like, if you're ordering a cup of tea at a cafe, give me a cunting cup of tea. It's just like part of the vocab here. It was the second time I ever heard it on film. And the first time was in Hal Hartley's film Trust, where it's used, again, to very powerful effect in a very different context. But it was so rare, I think, that, the fact that I can remember the first 2 times that I heard the word cunt on film. I don't remember the first time I heard the word fuck on film. You know what I mean? Like, this, it's really significant. It's a really conscious choice. And it's a kind of ballsy move for 2024 to have dialogue like that. For 1974, it's like, holy shit.
What? But Alex, I'm curious though, because you're not the first Australian to be on the show that has told us, like, cunt is a very common word over here. But I guess I'm curious though. So how did you remembering the first time you heard cunt on screen? If it's so common in Australia, like so, how did you know at that young of an age? Oh, this is kind of like a big deal. Yeah.
Well, you just never heard it with, I mean, in Australia, we couldn't tell the difference between American and Canadians, so please forgive me. But it's the first time, I mean, we when I was growing up, there was sort of obviously quite strict censorship laws, so you wouldn't hear it in Australian content.
Right. Okay.
But you wouldn't hear it, you never heard it in American films at all. No. So, the first time I heard it was never in anything mainstream. So it was, this Hal Hartley indie film and this sort of old forgotten horror film. And both times was like being struck by lightning. Like, it was really shocking. And I think it's incredibly powerful the way that it's used in Black Christmas. I think it's just as powerful as it is in the Hal Hartley film, even though these two films are very, very different. It's shocking. It just speaks of a kind of violence and a transgression and an aggression that is all tied up with the use of that word. And especially in the context of what's being said. Like, it's very sexually graphic. It's not it's cunt as a noun. Like, it's not a kind of a flippant exclamation like it is generally in Australia.
It's very like, Billy's dialogue is very illustrative, I guess I will say. It paints a pretty piggy picture.
Jesus.
But we also say cock too, which I feel like cock is not a word that you see outside of like pornography a lot in American cinema.
Yeah. It's very graphic, this entire conversation. And then the fact that it ends with, I'm going to kill you. Like, it's just very much...
And that incredible change of tone. We have that introduction of that voice. This very calm voice. It's genuinely shocking. And again, I think, the sound work in this film is just electric.
I think it's also something, too, where it's like Billy's the one hanging up on them. Like, very rarely did the girls hang up on them. So even in the phone calls, he has the power.
Yeah. Yeah.
Definitely.
Okay. So this is when Claire and Barb start to get into it a little bit. So it's not quite a house divided, but there's definitely people who feel a little bit more amenable to the way Barb handles it versus Claire. I think this is meant to illustrate that Claire is a bit of a prude, even though, when we get into her room, we're going to see that it's actually pretty progressively decorated. We'll put it that way.
But she's not having sex and like being like and getting drunk like Barb.
Right, exactly. So we have a kind of good girl, bad girl vibe going on with the two of them. And then we introduce Mrs. Mack into the mix. So she struggles to get the door open. That will become a small plot device as we move through the film. But she is played by Marion Waldman. And so we kind of diffuse a lot of the tension when she comes in because she is a bit of a source of mockery. Like the girls have gotten her this moo for Christmas and they want her to immediately try it on. And it's very desexualizing, right? Like they look at her as a kind of archaic figure. And she's like actually just getting drunk all the time and talking shit about them to herself.
I just love that line. It's like, I wouldn't wear this to get my liver out. she's such a great character. I know, Betty Davis, we love Betty Davis, and I can imagine Betty Davis in this role.
Yeah.
But I love Mrs. Mack. There's something about her that's almost cartoonish in a really appealing way.
Yeah, she's abrasive, but she's also very lovable.
She's so lovable.
Which, and obviously, Betty Davis would have done gangbusters with this, but I feel like I do associate more abrasion than lovableness with Betty Davis.
Right. Yeah. I think Barb says at one point, just as she arrives, something like, it's like Miss Vaudeville 1898 or something like that. And I think that's such a, that's exactly what Mrs. Mack is. She's a vaudeville character.
Yeah,
Like she's got this kind of ye-olde cartoonish vibe to her. It's gorgeous and really great writing around her.
The running gag of the hidden booze, honestly, never gets old. Like it is so funny.
It's such classic Bob Clark humor,
right?
And when he speaks so affectionately of his Mabel or Myrtle or whoever his aunt was, he's like, no, she literally would hide it in hide bottles of booze in the toilet cistern.
Oh, so
and this
funny.
Sort of delight that he has talking about it.
Yeah, the toilet booze is the one that I think gets everybody. We can imagine booze hidden in dressers or closets or coat pockets, even books in the library. But the idea of brushing your teeth and then fishing out a bottle of booze from the toilet to do a bit of a mouthwash before bed, wild.
What booze is she drinking? Did we get a good look at the label? Like, is it rum? Is it whiskey?
I tried to look it up, and
it's something brown. It's like a whiskey or a rum. Yeah.
I thought that my other default was maybe it could be a sherry, but I think she's drinking it too heavily.
I'm going to say brandy. That's my bet.
Yeah,
maybe so. Maybe so.
Yeah,
like cooking sherry or brandy. She seems the type.
Yeah. So in this mix, we also are briefly introduced to Peter, but only on the phone. So he is played by Keir Dullea, and we immediately get a sense of the relationship between Jess and Peter because he ends the phone call by saying that he loves her, and she says she knows.
Bum, bum, bum.
It's like movie code for like, well, there's your plot.
Something is amiss in this relationship.
Verbal punch in the dick right there. Right in the dick.
I mean, we'll find out he deserves it, so it's totally fine.
Absolutely.
Well, also, I'm sorry, do we like his page boy haircut? Because I do not like this haircut.
It's the 70s. Everybody looked like this.
It goes with his, skivvy, with his, turtleneck.
Yes.
Kind of vibe.
Yeah.
I've seen calendars of 1974 less dated than that guy's hair.
Oh, wow.
And I think the rest of the film is actually pretty on point, except for the moo-moo. But, stylistically, they were pretty sharply dressed. I love Barb later has this very sort of jaunty denim cap on a kind of jaunty angle. It's like, that's hot. Mm-hmm. But Peter is like, dude, I would not tap that.
The film goes out of its way to make Peter as unsexy as possible.
Right.
A little bit, yeah. And then, we can talk about the fashion sense that Jess has because obviously there's one very iconic sweater, but even I would say her yellow shirt is quite flattering. I think, Alexandra, you mentioned earlier she has a kind of regalness to her.
Very elegant.
I think it passes over to the character as well. You could say that there's something just a bit more sophisticated to Jess than all the rest of the girls, but she comes off as more mature, more sophisticated, a little bit more maternal in the way that she's actually looking after the sisters. But I think we now default associate that with, she's just a classic final girl.
It's really interesting because she very much is sort of policing the kind of very delicate interplay between Claire and Barb in that early scene, and she sort of reprimands Barb, don't be such a bitch.
Yeah.
And I mean, this is probably something that we haven't touched on explicitly, but Bob Clark has talked about a lot in depth. The heart of this film is the intimacy and the tenderness between the girls. So much of there's whole scenes in this film that are just the girls talking to each other.
Yep.
And it's beautiful and it's amazing. And it's a real precursor, I think, to the kind of relationship between the women that we see in Halloween. But the fact that in this film he allows such space for those relationships to be tender and to develop, and the way that Jess sort of pulls rank with Barb. And Barb is obviously just kicking into Claire because she's just had this terrible phone call with her mother.
Yes.
It's all very subtle. But Jess is like, you know what? Actually, don't be a dick. And it's the way that you talk. You know, Bob Clark's he talks so much about it, wanting it to be a kind of authentic vision of like relationships and young women. And it's like, yeah, that's how I talk to my friends. Like if somebody's being a dick, you say, don't be a dick. Like, you know.
It's interesting because, not to take anything away from Halloween, but I feel like we should be having that same conversation about Black Christmas and the relationship between the girls. And this, again, feels like another time that we just sort of forget this movie.
I was really shocked, like going back to what I was saying earlier about discovering this film in sort of the late 90s. It's like all of the sort of, I mean, and again, this is, I love Halloween. But this film goes above and beyond in terms of that kind of dedication and that focus on those female relationships. This film does it so much more extensively.
And Halloween does borrow it with the girls. You know, like you do spend a lot of time with the girls before the killing begins. But there's an authenticity in both of them that I do think is explored more in Black Christmas. That these feel like real people. They don't feel like movie characters.
The way that Barb's drinking plays into it for me is the way that that for me is really key. And that I don't often drinking in film is really coded in the way that we see it with Mrs. Mac, like this.
It's alcoholism,
right? Or it's like a social issue. But with Barb, she just sometimes drinks a bit too much and gets a bit mouthy.
Yeah.
You know, and Barb's clearly got a problem with alcohol. I love when she pulls out a can of beer in the police station and just starts drinking. Feel like outside of her handbag, just starts sculling beer in a cop shop. It's amazing.
Why don't you just funneling booze down this child's throat?
Oh my God. It's so inappropriate.
That is incredible.
So
That's one of those things. I've seen this film so many times, and then I was watching it recently, and it's like, she's getting that kid, like 6-year-old kid. What does she call him? Like schnockered?
Schnockered.
She's like, he's schnockered. It's like, oh my God, that's a child. What are you doing? Like, she's clearly got a problem with alcohol. She clearly has some issues with her mother, but the delicate, like, it's not force-fed. It's not this sort of social issues thing. You know, we're not force-fed this sort of drama around that. It's just who she is. And there's that really crucial scene, I think, with Claire's father and Phil, where the turtle scene, which starts off so joyful and then gets so nasty.
So dark.
And it's just like, I've been like, you know what I mean? When you're around somebody who's drunk and you're sober. Yeah. Like, and it's mean. So authentic. It's so authentic. And just the huge tonal shifts. You know, one minute she's laughing and the next minute she's angry and then she's, oh, you will hate me. And the way that Phil kind of pulls her into, you know, like, you are drunk. And then Barb finally gets it and she's like, okay, I'm going to go to bed. Incredible scene. And so much of the film, I think, really hinges on this dynamic between the women, the way that they are with each other. Not even so much what's said, it's just the way that they be. You know, their way of being with each other.
But that's the thing, is like, you know, when you hear, oh, it's a sorority house full of girls that are getting picked up one by one.
Bitches.
No, but it's just like, there's really only 3 girls we're following for this entire movie. It's Jess, Barb, and Phil. There are other girls in this scene played by members of the crew, by the way. Because yes, I get the slasher label for this, but it's not like we're just killing people constantly. It's Claire, and then it takes 30 minutes for Mrs. Mac to get killed.
Yeah, I guess the other interesting thing is that, as you suggested numerous times now, Alexandra, the film isn't hitting us over the head with like, oh, here's like the slutty drunk one, and can't you just spot the archetype kind of pieces. You know, we can see it if we're paying attention, but it feels coded in a way where none of these are problematic character traits. They're just, this is who Barb is, this is who Phil is. And I think, Trace, that's why you said they just feel like real people.
Right.
But I guess what's shocking to me is I remember watching this film as a teenager. So it would have been probably late 90s. And my sister, like, she has a love-hate relationship with the film where sometimes she'll be like, yay, Black Christmas, and other times she fucking hates it. And, you know, that's a thing. But I remember at one point she said, "Oh, Barb, she's just the drunk bitch of this film." And I thought, no, that's not giving this character or the actress enough credit for how she plays Barb, because that's why it's so integral that we're introduced to Barb in this moment of weakness when her mom is disappointing her. And sure, yeah, like there's definitely elements throughout the film that suggest, yeah, she has a drinking problem. She probably has, she seems like she enjoys sex, we'll put it that way. But these aren't character deficiencies, and they're not traits where we say, oh, well, we can just put her into a slot and we know exactly who she is. Like, I think people overlook how wounded Barb is.
I agree. And I think a really key scene is just before she dies, when she has an asthma attack.
Right.
It's such an interesting thing to write into the screenplay, because it shows this incredible vulnerability and this incredible need for the connections that she has with the other girls that she lives with, Jess. Mm-hmm. And there's this incredible duty of care that these girls have for each other.
They know about it. They're used to this. They've done this before with her.
Beautiful, beautiful stuff.
Is there any hint that Barb is asthmatic before that scene?
Never.
Okay, and that's the thing. So lesser films that would copy Black Christmas, the asthma thing has become a thing where it's like, oh, we're going to introduce the inhaler and then it's going to cause a problem later. Like, and that we don't do that. Like, the asthma is used as a character development thing for the relationships between these girls, and that is awesome. It's not lazy.
Right.
No.
Look, I grew up very much, in the 90s, sort of, going to university in the late 90s, early 2000s, very much that horror was coded as, the slutty girls get killed.
Right. Yes.
And that was sort of a kind of starting point for discussion about gender and horror. And then I look at this film, and again, I felt so ripped off. Like, I felt so ripped off that this film had been removed from that kind of academic conversation.
Right.
At the time about gender, because this film is like, these are sexually active young women, like, and it is so progressive in how completely accepting it is about that. Obviously, the fact that Jess is pregnant is a really key one there, but the way that Barb talks about sex when she's drunk, like, this is not anything that these women are punished for or anything kind of like that. It's just part of their personalities. The
film doesn't judge them for it at all, and it's so refreshing. I mean, granted, I guess like Barb is technically like the quote unquote slutty archetype that would kind of come out of this trend of slasher films, but even still, I don't feel like she's being punished for her penchant for drinking when she dies.
No.
There's nothing puritanical about this film, and obviously the key conversation there is around Jess having a pregnancy terminated.
Right.
She's our central, she's like a solid, sensible young woman. Mm-hmm. And there's no point that you ever think maybe Peter's right. Everything he says is monstrous. Everything he says. When he says to her, how can you have an abortion? You haven't even asked me. We don't need her to say, how about you go get fucked? Because we're thinking it already. And the film there's no pause. Like, there's no moment where it's like, oh, maybe Pete. It's unrelentingly on her side. There is no room for discussion about it being her body, her right, her choice. A contemporary film, I don't think, could be that easy and that kind of confident. You know what I mean? Like, it's remarkable.
Yeah, with every single line of passing dialogue, Peter gets worse and worse. I mean, I think it's his "Don't you ever consider anyone but yourself?" Like when he's like
he calls her selfish.
Well, but again, that's been the conversation between Peter and Jess. Whenever he said, because he's gonna quit being a pianist or whatever, and she flat out tells him, just because you're giving up on the things you wanted to do with your life doesn't mean I want to give up on the things I want to do with mine. Yeah. I can't marry you. That gets in the you and this baby get in the way of my plans for myself. And how fucking awesome is that is in this movie?
The fact that Bob Clark made it so explicit. Yeah. He understood the urgency. He understood the importance. There's no metaphor here. And I just, if this film is valued for anything, I think it is for the unhesitating courage and explicitness that it talks about reproductive rights. This is the year after Roe versus Wade. It's like, this stuff is contemporary, and this isn't a social issue to discuss. Mm-hmm. This is just a factual, it is her body, it is her right, and you are a fucking asshole if you think any different. To the point that you are almost coded as like a kind of red herring possible killer.
Yeah.
Like, it's just unhesitatingly progressive on that front in a way that, as I said, this is 50 years ago, and I think even now, like if a film came out now doing something similar, people would be, oh, it's so brave and challenging. It's like 50 years ago, Bob Clark had no time.
Yeah.
There was no sympathy, none of this bullshit two-siderism stuff. Amazing. Just so incredible.
And it doesn't even feel preachy. Like, it doesn't feel like he's monologuing to the audience. This is just life.
Right. It's not a social issues film.
Yeah.
Like, it's not like, what is the emotional outcome of her making this decision? She's fucking fine with it. The only problem she's got is that there's a serial killer in the roof.
Yes,
and her boyfriend is a dick. They're Jess's problems. Terminating the pregnancy, she's thought about it. She's taken it seriously. She's weighed it up. But that's not the heart of the story.
And I cannot overstate how fucking refreshing it is that we are actually saying the word abortion in this movie. Because, like, folks, if you want to listen to our discussion about Apartment 7A, we do have a Patreon episode on it. That's a movie from this year. And technically it is set in 1965, but we're not saying abortion in that movie. We're saying we'll take care of it. Even though we do show a failed abortion sequence in that movie, it doesn't have the gumption to actually say the A word. And I'm not going to lie, I do think it's important that this is a Canadian film. We have a very different relationship to abortion. We don't have the religious angle that Americans tend to associate with it. But I am going to also bring in my one and only reference for this entire episode. It is C.H. Newell. It's a piece for a website called Father, Son, and Holy Gore, and the piece is called Resisting and Reproducing Gendered Ideologies in Black Christmas. But the piece I'm actually pulling is a historical one, so apologies to this author for not citing more. But it's important to note that in Canada, in 1973, we had actually had a very public abortionist named Dr. Henry Morgentaler, who had opened abortion clinics in Montreal in 1969 that were raided in 1970. And in 1973, he announced that he had successfully performed over 5,000 abortions. And between his ratings in 70 and then 74, when this movie comes out, he was actually acquitted of the earlier charges. So there is a conversation that is happening around abortion and reproductive rights in Canada when this movie gets made.
Gotcha.
Amazing.
Well, but also that it's an American in Canada, this American expatriate doing this in Canada.
Well, that's because we're just so vibrant, as he said.
Yeah, the country and the people, just vibrant and full of life.
Truly, except when we're killing babies. Yeah. Well, let's talk about Claire, because we're basically up to the scene where she gets murdered, and this is our first big violent set piece in the film.
I love this. I love there's a jump scare. Is there a music cue when he jumps out of the closet? I don't think there is. So. If there is, it's very subtle. This is horrifying, and I honestly, like, the fact that no one ever finds Claire's body in this attic.
Really chilling stuff. Like, the ambivalence to that is just so dark.
And it's really, I mean, the shot when the cat jumps on her, the imagery, it's not even bloody. He just, quote unquote, strangles her with this dry cleaner bag. And the image of her in this chair is so striking. And we keep cutting back to it. And just her open mouth, like, face. Ugh.
And it's that classic, like, to go back to that, like, oh, horror's puritanical and it always kills off sexually promiscuous women. It's like Black Christmas. Like, the first death, and the key death that we keep returning to
is the good girl.
The gore we see is a girl who, really, that's the only thing we know about her, is that she's this virgin, this sort of nice girl, and the joke is that she's this sort of, what is it, the professional virgin.
Yeah. But that's the thing, though, is because like the killing the slutty girls wasn't a trope yet, so it's not even subversive at this point in time. Right. It's only when you look back and you're like, oh, it is subversive.
Right. So it's not transgressing. It's not like subverting it. It's like, it's just from the outset, it's sort of saying, actually, it's fine for women to be kind of, it's just to be people.
Yeah.
So then I guess it would be Halloween that started the promiscuous girls are the ones that are getting killed, because that's
typically, that's what we associate it with.
Yeah.
Okay, so we do have Claire's father, Mr. Harrison, who is played by James Edmond. He is seen the next day waiting for her. And yes, as you mentioned, Trace, this is in front of the University of Toronto campus. So, folks, you can absolutely go and take a bunch of pictures in and around this area.
Joe, you'll love this. I know I mentioned Urban Legend at the top, but my husband walked by me while I was watching this, and he goes, oh, that looks like the college from Urban Legend. And I was like, it is the college from Urban Legend.
Correct. Yes. Fingers crossed if everything goes correctly. I will be taking my Salon Macabre girls and we will be doing a walking tour of the shooting locations for Urban Legend and then watching the movie in November.
That's awesome. That's awesome.
Yeah, so...
Technically an Australian film. I'm going to, it's not, but I'm going to claim.
Just Jamie Blanks, right?
Oh, yeah, Jamie Blanks Australian. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I mean, he had to leave the country and come and make it here, so that...
Yes.
I'm going off topic, but so many of that kind of era, like my favorite, Cherry Falls was Jeffrey Wright.
Oh, yeah.
Another Australian. And Cherry Falls is why is that film not as big as Scream? I don't know why that film isn't as big as Scream.
Well,
it's such a incredible film.
That's Columbine, and its release was botched. I don't know if you know this, but it was supposed to go to theaters, but then Columbine happened, and people were really upset about the orgy scene, and so they butchered it, cut stuff out, and then they released it on a cable network as a TV movie, and it didn't go to theaters here in the States.
I didn't know any of that. That's heartbreaking because I think it's one of the great slasher films.
I think it's really good. You can tell it's compromised, and unfortunately, the footage that was cut is lost forever. They will never be able to recover it.
Yeah, because there was definitely more scenes that sort of unpack some of that stuff. And yeah, you can just sort of see where some of the edges are missing.
Yeah.
Heartbreaking.
Okay, so we do have this party for underprivileged children that because, we're a sorority and we have a partnership with a fraternity, we are expected to do these kinds of things around holidays and philanthropy. And Mr. Harrison ends up eventually going there after meeting Mrs. Mack, and the relationship that these two have. I mean, the scenes of her trying to cover up Claire's posters and suggesting that Claire is a good girl and that, they don't get up to untoward things in this sorority house. It's all just comedy gold.
We spend so much time focused on that one poster of the grandma who the final photo is her just flipping off the camera.
Yeah.
It's okay, this is one of the scariest movies ever made, but we have something like this in this movie. And the way it balances the tones is masterful. The comedy never feels out of place, and it never cuts down on the tension.
Really organic. Mm-hmm. And Bob Clark has spoken about that. He's life is funny. People are always cracking jokes. Even if things are terrible, that's kind of how you deal with life. You just sort of make snide comments or you kind of crack jokes, and that's sort of just what life is. Yeah. And it's so, obviously this film isn't documentary realism, but I do think that there is, it's not a horror comedy film. It's just, the kind of the presence of humor. The presence of humor, I think, is very alive. It's one of the things that gives this film so much color.
Yeah, it just makes it feel like, oh, this isn't a slasher film where people are only living in a slasher film. It's like these characters don't know that their friends are being murdered or that there's somebody lurking in the attic of their sorority house. They've got to go and deal with children, and it's ho, 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 fuck.
Ho, 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 shit. It's just such, I love it.
And just randomly for no good reason, we're just doing depth of field or depth of focus with some of these shots where we're seeing Mr. Harrison talking on the phone and we're seeing Barb in the background feeding this child booze. It didn't have to be this stylish.
And incredibly precise, I think. You hear Bob Clark talk about making this film and the precision with which he has conceived each shot. These are difficult shots to do on location in small rooms.
Well, but that's why, though, when you look at reviews at the time, again, these American reviews that were really trashing the film, and it's you don't see the technical prowess on display here. Well, I'm glad you brought up because again, these are big cameras they're dealing with in a real house. It's not a set, and he's finding ways to do these 360-degree camera spins in these really tight, confined spaces with these enormous cameras. It's wild.
Yeah, that final shot gets a lot of the attention for obvious reasons because it's one single take and it's incredible. Mm-hmm. But so many of these smaller scenes in this film, just the actual, if you actually kind of try to imagine how they would have physically have shot this stuff.
Right.
It's wild, really crazy stuff.
Yeah.
Yeah, even that opening party, right? Think of how many people are in that room. But then we also have to get a camera and all the people doing the tech part of it.
Or anytime it's on the stairwell,
Oh, God, that stairwell. So fucking good.
Yeah.
Okay, so eventually we put the pieces together that, hey, no one has seen Claire. She's missing. So we go to the police precinct, specifically Barb Phil, who is played by Andrea Martin, as well as Mr. Harrison. They go to report her missing. And this is our introduction to Sergeant Nash, who is played by Douglas McGrath, who is quite fucking famous in Canada. I don't think he'd even be famous to a lot of Canadians, but he's in one of the most important Canadian films of all time called Going Down the Road. It's essentially one of the first fiction English language films. It comes out of the East Coast, but it's one of the reasons why we have a Canadian film industry is like this was the first big litmus test.
That film is actually the reason he got cast. I don't know if you know this, Joe, but it has a sequel in 2011.
I did know that, and I've never seen it.
Yeah, I don't know, but he returns.
Okay. I love this actor. He's got so much personality. And, you know, Alexandra, this is obviously another one of our very shitty, ineffectual men that you were referencing earlier. But this character is another source of absolute delight. Like his interactions with both Barb as well as Lieutenant Fuller, the John Saxon character, are A+.
Incredible.
Okay, so this is the scene where Barb uses her leverage to make the fellatio reference in terms of the phone number, but also Jess is kind of on the case, so she goes to track down the boyfriend, Claire's boyfriend, Chris, at the hockey rink, because of course it's a Canadian movie, so we got to get some hockey in there. And we realize, oh wow, okay, no, she is definitely missing, but Chris will be, I would say, the best example of a man in this movie, apart from maybe Lieutenant Fuller, because he just storms this precinct, yells at Nash, and gets Lieutenant Fuller on the case.
Yeah,
I love his coat. He's got an amazing
coat.
And I love that, like that really brief scene at the ice rink. It's like Bob Clark was like, it's a Canadian film. We actually have to have that in there.
Well, but it's interesting that you're saying that, though, because if you notice in the police precinct, there are American flags.
The little American flag.
Everywhere. Like on every desk, in every corner. And that was just to make the film more marketable.
100%. Because that's, you know, Alexandra, you and I would both know this, but when you're dealing with Commonwealth films that you're trying to export into the international market, because that's where the money gets made, you need to be able to say you can sell the film internationally. And one of the ways to do that is to say, oh no, it's absolutely not Australian. It's not Canadian. Look at the flags. Look at the money.
Right. To borrow that academic description, you have to remove cultural odor.
Yes.
Right. Yeah. And this idea that American is sort of odorless, is culturally odorless, is really interesting. I think when you look at a lot of Canadian and Australian film, and that there's this attempt to kind of, American culture isn't odorless. You know, it's this sort of, this idea that it's neutral is not really, doesn't really hold.
No, it's not real at all. It's just the dominant one.
Chris is a really interesting character. He's not in the film a lot, but I think he's great. And, you know, he's one of those actors that's like, yeah, you know, he's going to be a total movie star. Like, he's amazing.
Yeah.
But the American distributors really wanted to hint that he was the killer. And Bob Clark was like, absolutely no way.
But he's not.
Right.
He's so clearly not.
Right. So I think the original, I'm going from memory here, so forgive me if I'm wrong, but I think they wanted to have him say at the end of the film one of Billy's lines to kind of imply that he was the killer. And Bob Clark absolutely shut the blanket. He was like, no fucking way. And it's a good for you, Bob Clark. Good for you.
He clearly knew when to stand up for his creative vision because, the ending of this film to me is part of the reason why it's a 5-star fucking film. Like, it's hugely important to its success.
It's devastating. It's absolutely devastating. And it does make it really enduring in that you will never, no matter how many times you watch it and rewatch it, you will never get that information. It's not a mystery that's hidden that you can solve. It's something far more ambivalent and hazy and challenging because of that, I think.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So one of the interesting things that I like, and I have heard people say that they don't like this about the film because they feel like it's not even a red herring. It's just an open storyline that doesn't get resolved satisfactorily, is the disappearance of this 13-year-old girl.
Oh,
I love that storyline.
Me too. It makes so much sense, but I think people feel like, oh, well, it doesn't tie into what Billy is doing, does it? So why is it even in this movie? And I'm like, it's character shading. How do you not see that?
Wait. Are we not to insinuate that Billy killed this little girl?
I think you can read it that way for sure.
I guess I've always read it that way.
I have too. And I think what's really interesting is that the film, again, you can't really talk about horror or horror at its best and not talk about ambivalence. To me, the best horror films are so deeply ambivalent. Yeah. And this film has it in fucking bucket loads.
Yeah.
Right? And there's all these, and I don't think it's a plot problem. These are I think it's a deliberate, conscious ambiguity that the film is it lies at the kind of thematic core of the film, in that But yeah, he's gone off and he's killed this kid. There's a scene later in the film where we find that the police outside of the house have been killed.
Yep.
But we're not privy to seeing the Billy character leave the house and come back in. There's this real, and I don't think that's a plot gap. It's just this really deep ambivalence. It's like, actually, the film isn't for you. There's this stuff happening that you're not privy to.
Right.
And it's this feeling of exclusion as an audience member, this feeling of being left out of vital information that we would otherwise need. That ambivalence is really bitter and really scathing and really sharp. I think it's, like I said, I think it kind of lies at the heart of the film in a way.
I even like, too, because when they find the girl's body, I mean, again, we don't get a ton of Mr. Harrison, like, in his we know how he feels, obviously. He goes into shock later. But there's that moment where they find the corpse of the little girl, and I mean, as a father, it's like, okay, well, I hope they found my daughter, but shit, if they're talking about a corpse, I hope it's not my daughter, and it's instead this other little child that this other woman's looking for. And
yeah.
And again, that we don't even show this girl's corpse, too, because it's meant to put us in suspense, too, even though we know it's not Claire. We know Claire's up in the attic, but still, like, there is an emotional heft there.
It's really, I mean, I think in the hands of another filmmaker, when the girl's mother, Mrs. Quay, I always call her Mrs. Quiff, but it's Mrs. Quay. And she was played by a woman called Martha Gibson, who Bob Clark raved about. He was like, she put in, like, one of the best performances in the film, and he's right. Like, she brings so much emotional weight. But I think in the hands of another filmmaker, you would at least have a cutaway to, like, a close-up photo of the daughter. There'd be some attempt to kind of humanize that the missing girl,
or even like a shoe or something.
Right, and there's nothing tangible. The only thing we have is the mother upset.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
it's very distant. It's very cold. It's very ambivalent, and it's so brutal. There's a brutality to the death of that child, which is really distressing.
I just love this idea that, like, so you two both immediately thought, okay, well, we know that there's a killer in this film and it's Billy, so obviously if somebody else has died, it is him. I've always looked at it as there could be somebody else committing murders. It's a big city, as we've heard Barb say, these kinds of things do happen. And I see it as, okay, this is a bit of a commentary on it's dangerous to be a woman or a girl in a place because you are just as likely to be murdered in midday as you are within your own home. But I think that both of those readings are applicable and right in this film.
I think you're exactly right. And I think that taps into the idea of the kind of the commonality of the prank call at the start of the film.
Right.
It's like, this is just another day.
Yeah.
Of getting dirty calls and the cops ignoring you and girls going missing. You know what I mean? Like, it's this sort of broader portrait or this broader kind of snapshot of life as a woman. And I think you're right. I think you're exactly right that it can be read. And certainly for myself, I think it's just a kind of default reaction to assume that it's Billy.
Sure.
But the film consciously doesn't show us that. Well, and I think you're exactly right. I think there's a reason for that, and I think it's to maintain that indifference or that that ambiguity.
And yeah, I guess for me it's more so because we meet quote unquote Billy, meet Billy like as he's entering the house, and the park where the girl has died is nearby. So I just assumed he killed her on the way. But I agree with both of you. I think even if it wasn't Billy who killed this girl, it ties into those themes that we've been talking about for the past 10 minutes.
Yeah, and even if you go back to Alexandra, you kind of hinted at this, but the way that the police treat both of the cases, right? So obviously Nash is a complete doofus and he doesn't latch onto the severity of either of the two complaints. But even Lieutenant Fuller, when he's meeting with this little girl's mom, he makes a deliberate attempt to say, oh, well, okay, is that late for her? She couldn't have gone to a friend's house. We should remember that this is the 70s. So the prevailing response to any kind of teenager missing was, oh, well, they're either, off shucked up with their boyfriend or something, or they're a teenage runaway. And that kind of shit happens all the time. And, it's not until later where we actually introduce a law that says we need to take this a lot more seriously because kids are not just constantly running away. Like, they're being lured out by predators and they are being murdered on occasion.
Well, the only reason that police take Claire's disappearance seriously is when Chris turns up.
Yeah, because it takes a man.
Right, and the film is... And Chris's anger, I think, in that scene is really great. Like, it's a really interesting creative choice. It's not him coming in to say, well, actually, I'd like to report Claire missing. He's furious. He's furious that the girls haven't been taken serious. Like, yeah, and he's like, it's been reported and you're still ignoring it. What the fuck is wrong with you? There's real anger there that doesn't necessarily, you understand it, but it's not a default setting for that scene. Like, that scene could be played in any number of ways. And I think the anger that Art Hindle brings there is really magical.
There's also a bit of a class critique piece to that, too. So we know that Chris is a townie. We've already made the reference that Barb makes off the top about, townies are just different. But the fact that he can storm in there, he knows Lieutenant Fuller because he is a member of this town. So he and Fuller have had interactions before, whereas the sorority girls, I think we're meant to assume, are congregating from places outside. That's why Mr. Harrison had to travel into the city to pick up Claire. So they don't have that kind of solid identity. They're not known to people like Lieutenant Fuller, and as a result, their claims don't get taken as seriously.
Well, I think Fuller even says to him, like, how's your brother? Like,
yeah,
they know each other, and I think that, we sort of mentioned the you can't rape a townie line that Barb delivers at the start, which I think from a contemporary perspective, if there's one like kind of moment in this film, that's probably it. But I think it taps, and again, I'm not agreeing with the sentiment or defending the line, but I think it taps into the character development of Barb in that the girls themselves are like, come on, dude, like it's an off thing. It's identified as the wrong thing to say in the film.
Yes, absolutely.
So it's not like everybody agrees with her. It's like, it's kind of, that's a really shitty thing to say. And that, it upsets Claire and it's like, you've just, Barb, you've gone too far.
Yeah, but it does distinguish them as not townies. Like, all of the girls in the sorority house are not townies. And it's part of the reason why we can make fun of Chris. Like, that's, I think, why Barb is fine calling Claire a professional virgin, because it's like, well, you're dating a townie. Right.
And, when Barb says that line, she puts on a posh accent.
Yes.
Darling, you can never rape a townie. Like, it's a really interesting delivery of that particular line. And I think it does a lot of heavy lifting. The shock of it perhaps doesn't kind of inspire us to kind of look into. But I think it's in a way, I think it's as heavily a loaded phrase as the use of profanity in the Billy calls. I think it's really consciously and very deliberately loaded to make Barb look a bit shit.
Yep.
Or just tone deaf. Like, just tone deaf. Like, she just pushes too far and she can't read the room.
Yeah. Like, she kind of can't help herself. And I think it's a really easy way. Like, I can't overemphasize how effortless all of the character development is. Like, we don't know a ton about these girls, and yet we know so much about these girls. Like, we haven't talked about Andrea Martin's Phil, but like, she really starts to creep into the center of the film when she comes back and she collects them for the search party. And, we learn that she's got a cold and her medication makes her a little bit snoozy. But like, there's that fantastic moment where she and Jess are startled by the search party that's going around, because it and like, any other film would cut this, because like, what are we learning except for the fact that they haven't locked the doors and windows, and you could sneak that in some other way. But this scene is so vital to understanding the relationship between Jess and Phil, but also the way that the sorority house fits within the larger geographic zone. And so like, it's just such a fucking good scene.
I love that scene so much. There's a line in it where they lie to the guys and they say, "Oh, we're upset because our dog just died."
Yes, because they want the guys to leave.
It's so.
I love it because it's like in any other film you would have, what's the backstory of the dog? And it's like here it's just like one of those kind of flippant throwaway bullshit moments.
Like, do they have a dog? No, I don't think so.
And we're kind of excluded. You know what I mean? We're kind of excluded from it. It's like the film is quite ambivalent about what we know and what we don't know. It's like, do they have a dog? It's like, this isn't for you. This is between the girls. Like, this is they're having a moment. Whether you as the audience know about the dog or not, this isn't for you.
But to borrow a word that you used earlier, Alex, it makes it all feel very organic, because at the end of the day, this isn't really a plot-driven film. I mean, yes, we have a killer in the attic, yes, but and we're looking for Claire, but there's not a ton of plot going on. And so something like this, that, as you said, Joe, could just be cut, that it's in here, it adds to the world of this film. And I'm saying the world, it's just the real world, but that organic quality is brought back because of a scene like this that could be cut, but I'm so glad they didn't.
Yes.
There are so many moments in this film that really, really emphasize and amplify the relationships between the girls, not in a kind of plot development way, but just in the way that their energy is with each other, just the way that they hang out and just the way that they kind of move in the world together. that, as you say, they're not plot related, but they're so essential to the kind of feeling of intimacy and tenderness that really lies at this film. And I think when people say that they don't like this film, I think it's those scenes that sit uncomfortably because they're not doing heavy plot lifting.
No.
But they're so at the heart of what Bob Clark was wanting to do with this film, which was was to move beyond that kind of beach party, juvenile, delinquent representation of young women.
Yeah,
and actually just to have a kind of a snapshot of these he wanted to present them as people. And I think that's exactly what the film does. And I think that line, that kind of, our dog just died, and they kind of giggle at each other's jokes, it's so organic. It might not be documentary realism, but it's organic.
Yeah. It scared the shit out of me. Okay, so why don't we talk a little bit about Mrs. Mack's death? So we do a little bit of careful plotting. So before we go out to join the search party, Mrs. Mack tells Phil, "Oh, I'm going to my sister's, so I may not be here when you get back." And of course, then that's why we don't have to go looking for her later. But do we have any thoughts about this hooking scene in the attic?
I know that Bob Clark wasn't thrilled with the choreography of this scene in terms of the kind of choreography of it being a kill. But the thing I think I love about this scene is one of the problematic, I hate that word, but one of the problematic men in this film that we don't talk about enough is Claude.
If
it wasn't for the fucking cat, if it wasn't for Claude, who's like licking the face of the dead Claire, Claude is an asshole. And if it wasn't for Claude, and it's like, did she really hit Claude in the attic, or did she hit Billy in the attic? And a Claude and Billy what's Claude's fucking damage? Claude, you asshole. And she calls him that at one point.
You little
Claude,
prick.
You little prick. Fuck you, Claude.
I mean, I love that Billy meows to lure her up there. I guess maybe he made Claude, or he got Claude to meow, but I always assumed that it was Billy throwing his voice.
Claude is a fucking collaborator.
He's a bad little pussy.
It's interesting that you said that Bob Clark himself wasn't happy with the choreography. It doesn't feel completely seamless, but I actually really like the way that this is shot. Like the POV of the hook coming towards us really puts me into that state of mind. And then watching her get gobbled up, it almost seems like a perfect mix of comedy and horror to me.
I think the kills in this film are immaculate. I mean, obviously, we'll talk more about the unicorn. The glass unicorn.
Well, that's the only bummer for me, is that we don't get a Phil set piece. I mean, we do. She walks into the room and the door shuts and we know what happens. But that's the only truly off-screen kill in this movie.
Yeah, the rest are hinted at, and then the one that we see the most of, I would argue, is the most damaging. So why don't we talk about Barb's death? Because this is gorgeous and fucking terrifying.
The way it's shot too, we're just because this is the goriest scene in the movie, but it's not a gory.
It's not gory.
You see, it's honestly just the blood through the unicorn figurine that you're seeing blood.
Yes.
But and the sounds that Margot Kidder is making, I'm assuming these are her sounds, but it's very tragic. I always get really upset when Barb gets killed.
Oh, of course.
It's really Baroque. I mean, it's got real Dario Argento vibes.
Yes.
It's as a kind of standalone horror vignette, it feels very Italian.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of indulgence into the kind of the aesthetics of the moment. And of course, the beauty of that sequence is how breathtakingly it's cut together with the kids singing, which is why Jess doesn't hear her. So we have that weird combination of the fact that we've already heard Barb have an asthma attack. That combined with the fact that Jess can't hear because of the singing, it's played very subtly. But that's why Jess is not running upstairs, right? It's because she's distracted by the kids and she's already heard Barb before have an asthma attack.
Yeah, it's the 70s version of someone walking by with a boombox as someone's getting killed and screaming upstairs.
Right. Yeah.
And just the time, and I think that's something that I keep coming back to with the visual editing and the pacing of this film, just the fact that Clark allows himself such time. He just gives himself room to do this properly. It doesn't feel like it's rushed.
No.
Just this incredible confidence in the pacing of these kind of sequences, I think really make it so enduring.
And just to go back to the songs, to just that macabre element of applying this, like, really, I mean, it's not a happy song. I don't think I don't call Silent Night a happy song, but like this, ceremonial Christmas song being played over this murder. And that's not anything new for the horror scene. I mean, again, I think in Last House on the Left, that's where Wes Craven's really playing with a lot of jovial music over like horrific visuals. But I feel like something like Black Christmas, I mean, I don't know if y'all remember this, but when that 2006 remake came out, it was really controversial. And there were like Christian groups picketing the film because it was released on Christmas, just because of that.
Yep.
And so, I mean...
Grow up.
I know. Didn't make it any more money, but people complained about it.
Sure.
But still, there's something just so... There's an undercurrent of comedy to it, despite the fact that it's very tragic.
I would agree with you in other sequences. In this case, I only find it tragic, but I think it's because I've emotionally invested the most in Jess and Barb at this point. I obviously saw this film after I had seen Superman, so there's a weird kind of cultural disconnect where people who watched this film when it was first released wouldn't have had this relationship with Margot Kidder, but I'm watching Lois Lane in part get murdered, and it is really fucking upsetting because, pinnacle of childhood, just like, wow, okay, this is happening.
One thing I think that's really interesting to keep in mind too is that we look at this film very much in retrospect through the lens of the final girl.
Absolutely. Yes.
Which, Clover kind of coined that phrase in 92. I mean, people like Jamie Lee Curtis had been talking about the final girl, but just not calling her that. When she was like, when Jamie Lee Curtis was promoting Blue Steel, the Catherine Bigelow film, she was like openly talking about the final girl dynamic. So Clover coined the phrase, but this is something, a kind of character type that had already been identified and been discussed. But in this film, I was actually really surprised with this. So Margot Kidder won the Canadian Film Award in 1975 for Best Performance by a Lead Actress.
There we go.
So she was considered by the industry, at least, to be the lead character, the main character. And I just always assumed that it was Jess, and it's like, at a stretch, it's an ensemble piece. But it really does change your reading of that scene, I think, in particular, and our emotional connection to that scene. We're almost in Psycho territory with Janet Leigh, right? Where our main character is killed off into the film. And it's like that's a really different way of thinking about that scene, especially.
Well, and actually, just like what we just talked about with Texas Chainsaw Massacre a couple weeks ago, where Sally isn't like the obvious final girl of that movie. She just is when everyone else happens to die. Like, she's not even the focus of the film. And granted, I would argue that Jess does get more of an arc in this film because she has the abortion plot in a way that Phil and Barb do not. However, they all seem equally as important,
Yeah, especially as we make our way into the back half of the film. As I said, I do think that we give a lot of mileage to Phil, in part because we also all love Andrea Martin, and the character herself, like, she doesn't have a lot of depth to her, but all of her interactions with the other girls is so warm and empathetic, and I mean,
you're exactly right. We
she's
feel
just so vibrant.
Affection for her almost by virtue of the affection that the other girls feel for her.
Yeah. But what a fascinating sort of dynamic to have as our final three girls, because, they're all very different, but complementary in a lot of ways. And I mean, it's interesting to see how people respond when it's basically down to just Jess, because once we kill Barb, Bill is not long for this world. And then it's just Jess, and I think Olivia Hussey has to do so much fucking heavy lifting because it's her on the phone. And technically, as we as an audience are seeing her interact with Fuller, with this guy Graham from the telephone company, so we can do the classic, we're cutting back and forth between her on the phone and then Graham running and trying to trace the call. And it's all very exciting. But if you look at it from just Jess's perspective, it's her in this empty house for like the better part of an evening, hoping not to be murdered.
Well, but she doesn't even know it's empty because everyone else is dead.
Yeah.
The big thing that people sort of tend to use as a criticism, certainly in reviews in the US when it came out, was, why doesn't she just leave the house? And to me, that's like the dumbest.
That's the stupidest question.
I don't like to dismiss people as dumb, but to me, in this case, it is the dumbest, most shallow. It's like, did you see the film? Like, it is
Barb
so
and Phil
clear.
are still in the house. She needs to protect her sisters.
And the film has established the fact that she loves these girls. They are really close. And Hussey gives this great performance, where she realizes the call is coming from the inside of the house.
Oh my God.
The look of horror is that she looks upstairs and she's absolutely terrified that her friends are in danger. It's like, why would she leave the house? Well, because she's not a different character.
Well, and like they haven't been hundreds of movies like this for her to be like, oh, I've seen this movie, don't go upstairs. Like, this is original flavor.
Right.
Just
watching Hussey scream up the stairs for these girls.
Her voice kind of breaks at one point, and it's devastating. Like, the absolute terror that is in that performance. It's so eloquent.
I do find this movie very scary. And it's not a movie I found scary until my second viewing, which was like years after I'd seen it for the first time. But there's a scrappiness and like a roughness to the entire climax of the film with her being chased around this house. And I think my favorite moment is when he grabs her hair through the stairs to pull her back. Like, again, there's just something like, it's clearly choreographed. We like, the news is going to happen, but it feels unrehearsed in a way that you don't see that a lot in slasher films, I feel like, or horror films in general.
And the sound design in that sequence comes into bat in just an astonishing way, and you don't realize it, you don't register it until you watch it 50 times. But the incredible sound design in that sequence is just so distressing. It's like really intense.
Well, that, and I think the editing, like, we spent a lot of time, Alexandra, you might not know this about us, but Trace and I are very appreciative when filmmakers will show us the fucking geography of where the film is set. Yep. So, like, we know the layout of the sorority house. Like, we know where Jess has to go in terms of getting down this winding fucking stairwell, and that she will have to get by this banister in order to safely exit. But there's still that moment, like, there's something in the editing where the hand seems to come out of fucking nowhere. So even if you are expecting, okay, she's going to have to pass that spot, I've seen this movie probably 50 times. And every time he grabs the hair, I'm just like, oh, fuck. Oh, right. Okay, that's happening.
Well, I think, just in terms of those spatial dynamics, so much of the world of the girls in the house is so separate from the presence of in the attic.
Right.
And that's the moment that it really collides. So, we're told, the call is coming from the inside, and we know that the call is coming from the inside. But that's the moment that they kind of physically meet, the point that those two things physically meet. Because even with the killing of Barb, we don't, and Mrs. Mack, we don't see that presence. Like, we see kind of a hint of it, but they're not like immersed in the scene in that kind of direct way that we see in that hair grabbing moment. It's terrifying.
I would say that, and I think the other scariest moment of this film is where Jess, just as she discovers Phil and Barb's body, is when she sees the eye. And we try to replicate this in the 2006 version, but because it's under the tile in the bathroom, it's a little hokey. But this one, like, when she looks up and sees that eye, and then she slams the door on Billy, and we just hear him scream, and that scream is so guttural. It's just so wildly effective.
Well, but it's also because, to compare it to that remake, it's less scary when it's an eyeball in the floor below you, but when it's just on the other side of an open door. And again, like, the first time I watched this, I don't remember that scene making much of an impression, but the second time I watched it, like, that shot of the eye chilled me to my bone. And it really,
I just got chills right now.
I know. And because I think he's also whispering something to her as he says
it. He's talking about Agnes.
Yes,
it's Billy.
But again, not to bring up the comedy again, but it's a thing where it's like a movie that can have me in stitches whenever the cop is laughing about the fellatio thing at the other at Nash.
Yes.
But then, like, I can be so, like, petrified during a moment, like 20 minutes later,
Well, that's the most that we see of Billy.
Yeah.
Like, we see, like, hands and a shadow, but that's really the closest that Billy comes to being something that's not just a kind of ambient
so disembodied, right?
Right. And that's the closest that we get to it being, to Billy being real. And I think that there's something so distressing about that.
Yeah.
The fact that it's never resolved. And I do think that actually makes sense, that it's actually more terrifying on subsequent viewings. Because the first time you're thinking, okay, there'll be a revelation, there'll be an explanation.
Right. I'll have reassurance.
When you go in later, that there's nothing.
No.
Billy almost becomes slipperier the more times you watch it.
He's such a shadow figure. Like, I think there's actually one moment where we get to see more of him. It's during Barb's murder when he raises the unicorn up right before he stabs her. We kind of get a bit of a flash of light across his face, so we can even see, like, a bit of his hairline and stuff. But even that, it reminds me of The Burning from like 1981. So it feels like that movie is just clearly evoking it even on the poster art. But here it's just like, I never caught it literally until this rewatch, but when Jess goes to tend to Barb after her asthma attack, Barb says, I had a nightmare where there was a man in my room.
Well, because he was just in her room.
Because he was in her fucking room. And I always just thought, oh, she had an asthma attack because she had a nightmare, not realizing, oh, she already knew, like she saw her death coming.
That presence.
Yeah.
And that's fucking terrifying too. Like the idea of someone being in your room when you're sleeping and having that close call. Like this movie is filled with close calls and the girls just don't know it.
Yeah. It's interesting the whole call, like the Billy and Agnes stuff, because I mentioned Session 9 earlier, which is one of my all-time favorite horror films. Absolutely scares the pants off me no matter how many times I watch it. I find it a genuinely creepy film.
Mm-hmm.
I can't watch it at home alone. Like it really freaks me out. And in a way that I can't rationalize.
Right.
Like in a totally subjective way. It just, I feel it in the pit of my stomach. But the way that the audio recordings in that film work is that they kind of provide a backstory. And you can put all the pieces together and it kind of makes sense. And the fact that this film so consciously forbids that.
Mm-hmm.
So it's almost the same thing in that it's present, but it's also absent at the same time.
Right.
There's real tension between presence and absence that even other very good horror films don't do.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I just keep coming back to the audacity of Bob Clark. It's like I'm going to make a horror film with a monster that you never see and you never learn anything about. Right. And you can try, there's the evidence that there's a story to put together. We know that there's a baby, we know that there's Billy, and we have enough of the bits that it should fit together into a puzzle.
Yeah.
But we don't have enough information. And I think that's why you get things like the sequel and, the fan films trying to make that puzzle fit. But to me, that sort of defeats the purpose because the fact that the puzzle can't be solved is exactly what makes it so scary.
Right. I mean, Trace and I are very much on the record as saying we don't care to know too much about our villain's backstory. Like, I definitely don't need a movie that explains who they are and why they are and even makes us feel empathetic to their situation, which appears to be a weird trend that Disney wants to go through right now.
Yeah.
But it just, I'm happy not knowing every little detail about my villain.
I feel like I'm being treated like a child. It's like I don't, I don't need to identify, I'm fine with not knowing. And I think there's extraordinary confidence. It feels like Black Christmas feels like a horror film that treats you like an adult.
Yes, but it's also because giving too much backstory, wanting us to relate or empathize with the killer, that dilutes any of the scariness of the film for me. And so, but the flip side is, so I do think Black Christmas is so scary because there's so much we don't know. But for some viewers, they just find that frustrating. It's the frustration clouds the scariness for them because they want to know more out of it.
They want the answers. Yeah.
Exactly. But I'm like, but I just want to shake their heads. And just be like, but that makes it scary. The unknown is what's scary.
Right. Well, I think that the real masterclass of that is Psycho.
Right.
Where Hitchcock always said that there's like a famous story that, the scene at the end with the guy in the white coat who gives the explanation. And Hitchcock's always said that scene made the film. And one reading of that, and it's a reading that I adhere to a lot, is that it's because it just doesn't work. You don't go, okay, cool, there's a rational explanation and I'm completely satisfied now. The fact that it is so unsatisfying that you do have this, here's your rational explanation.
Yeah.
And it still doesn't work. You're still left with this feeling that it's not fine. You get that final scene and it's like, so here's your logical explanation, but the logical explanation is deliberately ambiguous and ambivalent and weak.
Right.
And that to me is the power of Psycho. That's why it's such an effective film, because it kind of lays out this sort of psychoanalytic explanation.
But it's not satisfying.
And it doesn't hold. It just doesn't, it just isn't watertight. And to me, the horror of Psycho is in those gaps, and I think that Hitchcock knew that very intuitively and very consciously too, perhaps, that he knew that was the scene that would make the film scary. And I think he was exactly right. There's sort of this facade of like explaining everything, but the explanation doesn't hold.
But that's why this film is so effective, because in a way it's doing both of those things as well, right? Like, I think for people who are looking for simple answers, oh, well, it's Peter, because that's why Peter shows up. That's why he breaks in. That's why, even though Jess is quite literally like repelled by his presence at this point. I do think for some people it's satisfying enough that they can say, oh, well, this is shady behavior from Peter, so he must be Billy. And then, of course, the real ambiguity, the real power of the film is, well, no, because obviously there's a phone call at the end of this. And we know that Billy has not been discovered because the bodies are still in the attic and we could hear him moving around. And
also, like, Jess does kill her boyfriend.
Yes.
Like, fully kills him, which is that's the thing is, do y'all think Jess dies after the credits of this movie? Do you think he kills her?
Bob Clark, I think, is of the mind that she did. From what I've heard, is that the implication is that she's left in the house alone,
and she
Billy,
gets killed.
Yeah, she's drugged, she's asleep. So the implication is that she is.
It was definitely a thing too, where because we see Claire's dad, they're like, oh, he's in shock, and I was like, oh, good, they found Claire's body, thank God. And they don't. They don't find Mrs. Madigan. They don't find Claire.
So ambivalent. It's so bleak. Like there's still 2 bodies upstairs that are just still sitting there. Like that lack of resolution.
Yeah.
Is just so brutal.
But it's also so it's staunchly feminist or siding with feminism in the way that it implicates all of these men, because not only are they standing around a comatose Jess's bed, just having casual conversation as though she hasn't just gone through severe fucking trauma, leave the room, turn off the light, let her be, but they only, they don't take her to the hospital. They take Mr. Harrison to the hospital when he faints, and they leave this woman defenseless
alone,
with just a policeman out on the porch.
Yes,
after not having checked the entire house.
Yes, like the fact that they did not check the attic, like what the fuck, man? Like, ugh.
It's such a condemnation. Like it's a reinforcement because we've seen this behavior from the police the whole time, and we want to like Lieutenant Fuller because he is John fucking Saxon at the height of his hotness, but even he fails these girls at the end of the day.
Right. These continual failures by men throughout the film. I think that those scenes, and I really like them, but the scenes at the telephone switchboard, there's a line that Hussey delivers so beautifully, and it's one of those, like, it's kind of a nothing moment, but it always stays with me because her delivery is so human. Like it's such a beautifully delivered line. But the calls are coming in. She's on the phone, and then she finally speaks to Saxon, and he's like, I need you to stay on the phone longer. We can't trace the calls. And she's like, they're really upsetting.
They're really upsetting me. And he doesn't even respond to her. He doesn't care.
It's just such a humane little moment. And it's the line delivery is just extraordinary. But it's like time and time again, these men fail. Like, you know, by the time they do realize that the call is coming from the inside, it's like, well, it's kind of too late. You know what I mean? And there's the total ambivalence about the cops in the car out the front. Who get killed, who we never see, you know what I mean? We never see them.
No.
It's like there's sort of like an aura of failed policing there that we don't even really get to think about.
Black Christmas 74 said ACAB.
But I do think that, you know, if you were to push it, if you were of the mind that no, Peter really is the villain, and Clark has said no, he's not. And
I don't know.
The film, you know, the ending of that to me the ending of the film makes that pretty explicit. But even that is pretty incredible. The fact that Peter from the very outset is a character who is trying to talk his girlfriend out of having an abortion.
Yep.
The fact that he is presented as so unhesitatingly and unflinchingly evil is actually amazing. It's actually amazing. Like there's no room for any kind of moral grey area. He's just an asshole. He's just a bad guy.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
I love these scenes that we get of him, like when he's doing his failed exam in front of these people. You know, as you said, the sound is discordant and kind of terrible, but I love Keir Dulley's performance of this because he is sweating and he looks furious. And then later on, after we obviously assume that he has completely failed, he just takes, you know, what is this? Some kind of like planchard that divides,
like a music stand or something.
That's what it is.
Incredible. Yeah.
And the entitlement to say, oh, well, I fucked that up, so I'm just going to ruin this expensive piano because he is so angry.
And it's not like a temper tantrum. Like he's so calm when he does it. He moves quite slowly and quite precisely. Like it's just this very subtle, it's not like he's screaming and freaking out and beats it, you know, and trashes the piano. Like there's this very calm, slow movement as he sort of bashes into it. It's remarkable.
I mean, you do believe that he has the capacity to be a killer.
Right.
Like even the way that I think he says, he dismisses Jess earlier in the film and says, I've got so much on my mind, you need to leave. And then she walks halfway out the room and he says, Jess, I'll meet you at 9. As if like, okay, I command your time. I dictate your schedule. You will meet me to talk about this. And she has already made it clear. She made it clear from the very outset that she was not going to be swayed. And she tells him here, there's nothing left to discuss. I've made up my mind. You're just like, oh, wow. He really thinks that he has full control over her body and her decision making and just never wavers.
And the film never editorializes that. It never feels that that's a position that it needs to justify.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, well, of course it's her choice. Yeah, of course this guy's an asshole. There's just such clarity and courage in that perspective that, again, I don't think we necessarily see a lot today, 50 years later. I think it's incredible the way that this film just so openly and unhesitatingly frames the kind of ethics around reproductive rights.
And this is not a film about abortion.
Right. It's not a social issues film. It's just a thing that you go through in your life. You know what I mean? Like, it's just, it's part of life. Like laughing about your dog being dead, even though you don't know. You know what I mean? It's just a thing that happens to her.
Yeah.
Yeah. I've seen films that are about abortion and don't say abortion and don't deal with abortion as frankly as this. And that is the entire narrative of the film.
Right. It doesn't change her personality. It doesn't. No. It's incredible.
Yeah. I'm sorry, I had to come back to that because I do think as much as this film is a comfort watch because I love these characters and it's seasonal and so on, I can't get over the abortion storyline because I don't feel like I've ever seen it handled this way in any other film.
I'm always stunned by the audacity and the frankness and the bravery that this film tackles that. It just never, ever ceases to floor me.
Yeah.
And, I guess, knowing about Olivia Hussey's own background.
Right.
Like that's just like the kind of sledgehammer into that point. You know what I mean? Like, and this is a kind of fluffy horror film.
Mm-hmm.
This isn't like, this isn't what people call quote unquote serious cinema.
Right.
This film didn't get talked a lot during Me Too,
No.
And then yet there's this extremely just dazzling vision of women and autonomy and reproductive rights framed through the lived experience of one of the main actors is incredible.
In this slight, silly horror film.
Exactly. And it makes me angry at more serious film. You know what I mean? Like the more pompous film. It's like, look, this fluffy Bob, the guy who made Porky's got this really right. So what's your fucking excuse?
Yeah. Well, yep. I wasn't going to bring this up because I don't know how much of an important conversation it is to have. But I was going across Letterboxd yesterday and I found a review from someone who, it was a man, but he said, this is one of the most misogynistic films I've ever seen. And
what?
I know. And so
does he elaborate?
Well, Sir, I would like to have a coffee with you.
He doesn't elaborate. That's the thing. And so, of course, I wanted to reply and be like, how? But I know better. Like, I'm not going to fucking reply to some rando on Letterboxd.
To quote the late, great Lee Gabin, grow up.
But I wanted to ask, though, like, if we're playing devil's advocate for a minute, like, is there anything about this movie that you can say feels misogynistic to you? And I guess really, Alex, as the sole, like, woman identifying person in the room, like, I don't know. Like, can you see where anyone would detect misogyny in this film?
Look, I've written a couple of books on rape revenge film. My bread and butter is pretty dicey films when it comes to gender politics. So outside of horror, like I've thought a lot and watched a lot and written a lot about some pretty nasty films.
Yeah.
My job is not to bestow anything with the title of feminist or not feminist. I've actually found that the longer that I've been doing this, and I published my first book in 2011, so it's been a while now, something we don't culturally like to do is to acknowledge that filmmakers are like people and sometimes pretty complex. So right. Dario Argento, I wrote a book on Suspiria years ago. Dario Argento, to me, is a really, Brian De Palma as well, these are really great case studies of filmmakers who have made incredibly progressive films when it comes to gender politics, and have also made some stuff that's pretty like, whoa, pretty eyebrow raising, and actually pretty like,
Terrible.
You can't kind of dance around it in terms of its gender politics. There's some pretty stinky stuff there.
Yeah.
And it's like, maybe that's okay. You know, maybe the guy who made Porky's, and I haven't seen Porky's in a long time, but when I was a kid, that was like the dirty, horny movie.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, it's silly.
And I don't
silly.
remember, I haven't desired to revisit Porky's because I remember it being kind of uncomfortable to watch as a girl.
Well,
I don't know. Like I can't. You know, I'm not basing that on a recent watch.
No.
Maybe I feel differently now.
But you're not incorrect, though. Like Porky's does have a reputation for being misogynist.
Yes,
and I just don't think that it's a contradiction. I actually think it's very human that Bob Clark could make a film like this, like Black Christmas, that I do consider incredibly progressive and incredibly. The way that it approaches gender politics, the way that it approaches reproductive rights, the way that it approaches women and agency, really progressive. Yes, he made that, and yes, he made Porky's. Like, maybe sometimes human beings are complicated.
Yeah,
maybe God forbid, maybe I have some stinky views on stuff. You know, maybe nobody's in a position to, and maybe nobody should think that they're in a position to bestow from some fucking holier than thou position.
Yeah.
I bestow this with the label of feminist film, and this is a misogynist film. There are films, and these are the films that I love the most. There are films that actually have both.
Yeah.
And I found this a lot with the Rape Revenge book, you know, that most rape revenge films, some of them have incredibly progressive moments and also have incredibly stinky moments.
Right.
And those contradictions to me are what make them really interesting. You know, and if you move away from this sort of holier than thou position that you can bestow, this need to reductively dismiss things as one kind of political position or another. Grow up. Art is complex. Art is complicated. Artists are complex. Artists are complicated. People, viewers are complicated.
Mm-hmm.
There's no final verdict on the. You know, sorry, I'm ranting.
No. Trust me, I appreciate the rant because I agree with you. I think it's something that Joe and I have just come across of a lot, especially with the more, let's say, to take your term, stinky films that we have covered in the past.
Right.
There's a moral sanctimonious policing around the art you consume. And I'll even something as like, you know, people with the Terrifier movies, you know, like that's kind of like the hot thing right now where it's like, oh, if you like these movies, you are a sick person or you're a misogynist. Right. And I'm like, just because you choose to watch something that could be gleaned as misogynistic or whatever the fuck, like doesn't mean, like, I don't know. It's just a weird area of film. I mean, do I even want to call it film criticism? Because I don't think that people actually saying this are like film critics, but then it's like, well, what is a film critic? Maybe, I don't know.
I think that there's a desire to protect yourself. You know what I mean? And it's like I saw something and it gave me strange feelings. And instead of embracing the ambivalence of horror film in particular, it's easier to just kind of reductively flatten things out and distance yourself by being able to kind of give a verdict. And to me, it's the most boring way to engage in culture possible. Yeah. Like it just... I mean, a really classic example of this that I go to when I go on this rant a lot, but a film that I talk about a lot is William Friedkin's Cruisin'.
Oh,
yes.
That's a whole lot, right? There's a lot going on.
That's a lot of movie.
There's so much a lotness in that film. Some of it's pretty stinky. Some of it's pretty amazing. And I will never take sides on the stinkiness over the amazingness.
Yeah.
And I can't resolve that. And that lack of resolution, the lack that I can't reduce that film to a final verdict is what makes it so compelling to return to.
Yeah.
I'm literally screaming. I'm like screaming.
No, good. Feel the rage.
Just like Lee Gambon, like championed the Australian film critic Lee Gambon championed these kinds of films, and he would always finish by screaming out, "Grow up!" And it was a joke. It was like a running gag, but it's like, grow up. Like you don't need to. You know, do you want films to end with And the moral of the story is right. Not even happily, but to have everything spoon fed to you.
Yeah.
Like what a boring world if we didn't have complicated, challenging art. And I consider Black Christmas complicated, challenging art, but powerful and magical and enduring. And I love that this film was made by the person that made Porky's.
Yeah,
I think that's magical.
Well, and I think also maybe I'm gonna say the final word on this is just. If you find yourself as an audience member watching a film that you have conflict with, or that it isn't sitting right with you, or it's making you feel things, I would challenge yourself to think about why that is, and then think about how you can verbalize it so you can have or write about it, so that you can have a conversation, have a dialogue
100%.
with people about it.
That's your starting point, not your end point.
Because that's what makes art more interesting in my eyes. It's like I look at something a particular way and then somebody else has a completely different reading, and now we get to have a conversation about it. And that feels so much more interesting and engaging to me, as opposed to somebody who's just like, well, I don't like that, or it didn't work for me. It's like, cool, unpack that.
I tell people this all the time, where I'm like, okay, well, why didn't you like it? And they're just kind of like, oh, it just didn't work for me. I was like, cool. Can you go write 500 words though about why you didn't like it? Because I'm not even saying that as a challenge. I'm saying that as, because I'm sure all of us have had this scenario where you walk out of a film and say, okay, that's how I feel about it. This is probably my rating. But then when you're writing a review, it either goes up or down, because as you're digging through your mind and figuring out exactly like what you thought about each part of the film, then there have been reviews that I've been writing where I'm like, oh, I really like that movie. But then I write the review and I'm like, oh, this is actually more of a 2-star film than a 3-star film. Like, because of I searched my mind to figure out why did I like what I liked and why did I not like what I didn't like. And I actually think it's really important.
The failure in film criticism is fundamentally a failure in articulation.
Right.
And I think that we have, I'm not on Letterboxd because it's something that I see a lot. I used to teach at universities in like a different life, but the first week of first year of film studies, I would always teach Pierre Bourdieu, the French social theorist. And I'm paraphrasing here and I'm borrowing a phrase out of context, but he wrote a book called called Distinctions, which is all about taste.
Okay.
And a line that is from that I think about all the time, which to me is like the starting point of film criticism, is taste classifies and it classifies the classifier. So when you're talking about personal taste and you say, I really like A, B, C, and D, you're not actually saying anything about A, B, C, and D.
No.
The combination of those 4 things comes together and tells us about you.
Right.
Yes.
Criticism is totally different. Criticism has got nothing to do with taste. If you want to write about taste, then you're telling us about yourself. Everybody has taste. I have films that I really love or I really hate, and it's just a taste thing.
Mm-hmm.
Like, I can't justify them in any other way other than I really like them or I really hate them.
Right.
and there are, like, I really don't like It Follows at all.
Okay.
And I have no reason to justify. I don't think it's a bad film. I don't think it's a bad film at all.
It's just not for you.
Just don't like it. It's a taste thing. And by me telling you that, I'm not telling you anything about It Follows. I'm telling you everything about me.
Right.
When we do criticism, we are starting to articulate. It's art engagement. We're starting to talk about culture. We're starting to talk about politics. Film criticism at its best is the search for articulation. And that's why podcasts like these are so important, because nobody wants to listen to 2 hours of people talking about taste, because you're not telling us about, if we talked about taste, then we're not telling people anything about the thing that we're ostensibly talking about. We're just talking about ourselves.
Right.
But as film critics, what we're talking about are the things that we've covered here today, like politics, art, like how does art work? What does form mean? What does a particular film say about a particular culture at a given moment?
Right.
All of these things. And to me, that's so exciting. That's the magic. Taste, we all have it. It's fine. The least interesting thing about film criticism is taste.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot. And I think, listeners, clap for her.
Mic drop.
I was going to say, oh, wait. And is this why you've been on 200 plus physical media collection? Okay, there we go.
She just has great taste.
Great taste.
Right. Aside from anything else, everything that I like. And you know what? There's a wonderful film critic who's in the UK called Anton Patel, who I don't know if you guys know, but he's a wonderful person, an amazing film critic. But he often I thought to start with he was joking, but he often says, I've just got terrible taste in film. And he's an amazing film critic. And I've kind of leaned into that over the years. It's like, my personal taste is actually not terrific. And there are films that I love that I know are objectively shithouse, and I could never write about them because I have nothing to say. I just enjoy the experience of it on a purely kind of subjective taste level. And at the same time, there are other films that I know I'm missing out on because I just can't connect with them on a taste basis.
Okay.
And that's fine. That, we're human. We have taste. Taste is what makes us us. But I don't want to hear film critics talking about taste and nothing else, and using taste as a way to frame criticism, because it doesn't articulate anything about the text. It articulates only about that person.
Right.
Well, I
rant over.
No, I think that's a perfect way to conclude it. But nevertheless, so everyone, that is Black Christmas. But Alex, I mean, I know we've got on, but any final words on the film before we close out?
I have to bring this up because I think it's fucking hilarious. Over the years, the great John Saxon, doing Q&As or interviews about this film, would always bring up the fellatio scene.
Oh, okay.
And he was never quite sure it was pronounced right in the film. He always thought it was pronounced fellatio.
Okay.
And like as a one-off comment, you're like, oh, John Saxon, that's pretty cute. I've seen him give like a number of interviews now where he's brought it up.
He keeps bringing it up.
And he thought it was fellatio. It just adds so much to that scene if you just think of John Saxon sitting there.
Is it fellatio?
I just think that is the most gorgeous. Like, I hope John Saxon died a couple of years ago, right?
Yeah.
My dream is that somebody told that story at his funeral, or that it's on his tombstone. Like, it's like potato.
Can't pronounce fellatio.
Just adorable. Just the most adorable thing.
So fun.
Yeah, I love this movie. I think it's scary as shit. It's again, all the things we have said. It's a much easier watch. I think when I first watched it, back when I was a teenager, I think I thought it was not boring per se, but it wasn't kind of like the rush of a horror film that I was expecting when I'm hearing like it's one of the most classic horror films ever made.
You thought it'd be exciting.
Yeah, but here's the thing, though. I do think it's exciting.
Yeah, just in a different way.
It's just in a different way. It wasn't what I was expecting when I was, 16 years old. No, every time I watch this, I find more things in it, and I find more to appreciate about it. I love this movie. I love it.
Yeah, no, I feel the exact same way. It's a comfort horror for me for a reason, and I don't know. It's just a movie that, you know what? It's a taste thing. I can't fucking give up this movie because I love it.
If it's good enough for Elvis, good enough for Rotten Tomatoes. Like, all films should be based on what Elvis thought of them. Elvis loved. They should make this the tagline to the film.
Get
Elvis
rid of the tomato reading and just did Elvis like it.
Just bouffants, like little quiffs.
The Presley meter.
5 out of 5 Elvises.
There we go. I love it. Make it happen.
Well, before we announce what we're covering next week, Alex, I mean, I don't think we can thank you enough for coming in with all of your wonderful insight, but let everyone know, where can they find you on social media?
I am on Blue Sky mostly, also Instagram. Alexandra Heller-Nicholas is only one of me. I'm very easy to find.
Ooh, she's exclusive.
I love it. Easy peasy. Well, if you want to get in touch with us, you can reach us on Twitter and Instagram at HorrorQueers. Shoot us an email at horrorqueers@gmail.com. Find us on Letterboxd to keep track of all the films we've covered. If you want to chat with other listeners, please join our Facebook Horror Queers group. If you love us, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. We do love those 5-star ratings. We got a bunch for our 300th episode, so please do it for this 300th and change episode. Do that.
It's 304, by the way.
There you go. And if you want even more content, please support the show by becoming a patron at patreon.com/horrorqueers. If you subscribe today, you will get 339 hours of Patreon content, including this month's new episodes on Hannibal Season 1, Episode 10, It's What's Inside, Department 7A, Salem's Lot, The Redux, and a bonus episode on Freeway 2, Confessions of a Trick Baby, as well as our audio commentary on Wes Craven's New Nightmare for its 30th anniversary.
Yes.
Joe, we are continuing our tour through anniversaries and diva worship. I believe next week is just a diva, but boy oh boy, is it a memorable one.
Yeah, this will be interesting. I think this is a film I've only seen once, but Trace, I feel like after the not great fun that we had on the sorority house on Christmas Eve, we should revisit more of a Halloween festivity. So we're going to go party with Angela for Night of the Demons, 1988.
Oh boy, a classic of the genre, a really sleazy one, and I would argue occasionally misogynistic one at that, but I do enjoy it.
Yeah.
Oh boy, everyone, well, come party with us and Angela next week, but until then, we can cross out Black Christmas.
Indeed, and cross out Horror Queers.